Welcome. Take a moment to settle in. Let your breath slow, and let the day around you begin to fade. You've arrived at a quieter place, now one where the noise of modern life slips gently into the distance, and history takes its place. Tonight, or whenever you choose to listen, we'll step softly into a time many know by name, but few truly understand at the level of daily life. We are visiting Germany in the 1930s and early 1940s. Not the Germany of battles or front lines, not the speeches or headlines, but the quiet, pressing tension of daily existence. This episode is called Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in Hitler's Germany. And yet, this isn't a warning or a challenge. It is an invitation to explore softly, carefully, and without judgment what it was like to live under one of the most tightly controlled and silently watched societies in modern history. You won't hear the roar of tanks or the sounds of sirens, the shuffle of feet on cracked cobblestones, the quiet whisper of a neighbor warning not to speak too freely. Instead, you'll hear the creak of old doors. You'll walk, not run, through the narrow streets where choices were few and silence was survival. This isn't about drama. This is about routine. What did you eat when food was rationed? What posters lined the streets and told you what to think? What stories did children hear in school? And what secrets were never spoken at home? Imagine yourself, if you can, waking up in a small German town in 1938. They baked bread, they walked dogs. They listened to birdsong and watched clouds drift. They laughed sometimes. They wept in silence. And they waited. The radio crackles to life, but only with approved broadcasts. You dress quietly. You speak carefully. You wonder, not for the first time, who might be listening. A housewife, a Jewish shopkeeper, a child. The morning light filters through curtains you didn't choose. The walls are thin, in a tone soft enough to guide you gently toward rest. Even as we explore some of history's more difficult spaces, your neighbor across the hall hasn't been seen in days. We'll reflect on how truth was reshaped, how fear spread in silence, and how even the smallest decisions carried weight. You say nothing. A letter arrives, and it is not for you, but you read it anyway, because these days, even an envelope can carry consequence. In a world like this, one word spoken too loud, one book left in view, one question asked at the wrong time, ... can change everything. And still, people lived. Not someone powerful, not someone safe, but someone quietly trying to make it through the hours without drawing attention. Tonight, we'll follow them, gently, respectfully, and with quiet empathy. We will explore what it meant to live in a country where control crept into every corner of life, what it meant to survive, not as a soldier or officer, but as a teacher. There will be no graphic imagery here, no shocks, only the slow, heavy air of a time where even breathing freely could feel dangerous. And as always, we'll do so slowly, calmly. If you listen with your eyes closed, you may begin to feel it. The distant hum of a city tightly wound with rules. The smell of rationed coffee and old books. The flicker of candlelight on worn wallpaper. And the heavy silence that hung over dinner tables when too many questions were asked. We'll begin soon with a look at a single day in the life of an ordinary person in Hitler as Germany. You may find yourself drifting now. That's all right. Let your breath come easily. There's no hurry here. Let the tension of the modern world fall away. You're simply here to listen. And now, with the world quiet around you, we begin. A day beneath the gaze, the slow summer of an ordinary citizen in Nazi Germany. Imagine yourself waking not in the present, but in a quiet, modest apartment in southern Germany. The year is 1938. It is summer, but there is no air conditioning humming. No distant car alarms. No sound of a refrigerator clicking on. A small place with stone buildings and neat wooden shutters, nestled in a green forested valley. It is the kind of town where neighbors know one another's habits, where voices carry between open windows, the kind of heavy that signals a long, hot day ahead, thick and still, as if the sky is holding its breath. You've pushed the windows open to allow the breeze in, such as it is. Outside, laundry lines ripple faintly, though the air barely moves. You sit at the edge of your bed, feeling the floorboards beneath your feet cool still, but warming quickly. Nothing that attracts attention. The jacket you wear bears no pin, no party insignia. That's deliberate, though it makes you more visible in another way. You shift beneath linen sheets and listen to the world stir awake. But you eat slowly, looking out over the rooftops. As you descend the stairs, you pass your neighbor Frau Schmidt. No extra remarks, no wandering discussions. The maps on the wall have changed again. Borders shift. Names disappear. A country erased becomes a red smear on parchment. She nods curtly, eyes lingering a moment too long. You nod back, neutral, unreadable. A man on a bicycle passes by with a red armband on his sleeve. He whistles a tune you used to like. You look away. Pigeons nest along the gutters. A distant church bell rings once, twice, marking the hour. You touch each one gently, thinking of the students who used to sit there before their families left, or disappeared, or simply stopped coming. A cart rolls past on wooden wheels. A dog barks twice and then falls silent. You allow yourself one sigh, quiet, deep. The bookshelf remains unchanged. The forbidden titles remain untouched. You light a candle. The electricity flickers these days. It is closed now. The windows are covered in newspaper. The name above the door has been painted over. The smell of fresh bread is gone. In its place, silence. It is written in careful script, no return address. You listen to the quiet. You wonder how long this quiet will last. The words are vague but clear. An old friend, a warning. You fold it again and return it to the envelope. A neighbor pours water from a pitcher, and you hear it splash into a metal basin. A few people move quickly, as if reluctant to linger in open space. Posters line the walls, bold red and black, shouting slogans you do not believe. One is new. You don't read it. You've stopped reading them. You already know what they say. Your colleagues are polite, cautious, always listening. A pair of soldiers walk past. They speak softly, but laugh too loud. Their boots echo on the stones. You wonder who among them writes reports. You suspect one or two, but you'll never know for sure. And where the wind drifts down cobblestone alleys in the early hours, curling like smoke around buildings still sleeping. You nod and let him read. His voice is steady. He's been taught well. Boys in brown shirts, girls in dark blue. They are neat. Too neat. You remember when the classroom was louder, more unruly. Now, the students sit in rows with their backs straight. They recite the new lessons by heart, lessons crafted not for learning, but for molding. You feel it every day, the slow erosion of real thought. Only the gentle creak of wooden floorboards expanding with the warmth of the morning sun. You wash quietly. The mirror is small and warped, but you avoid looking at it too long. A few volumes remain, but you know which ones must be visible and which ones must not. On the shelf by the window, Goethe, Schiller, a Bible. On the back of the wardrobe, tucked beneath an old winter coat, Rilke, Mann, Brecht. You haven't touched them in months, though you think of them often. You're careful today. You're always careful now. You live in a town that might not appear in any history book. You are a school teacher, not yet old, not quite young. You are neither a Nazi Party member, nor outspoken against them. You are simply here, one of many. You read, you teach, you try not to draw attention. The sun has only just risen, and already the air feels heavy. Your small apartment is tidy, unadorned. The wallpaper is fading. There is no shower. Only a basin, a cloth, a bar of yellow soap. Your bookshelf is thinned over the last few years. Certain authors, once your favorites, are now forbidden. Their pages turn to kindling or hidden in cellars. You dress in plain clothes, light colors, clean lines. Breakfast is modest. Black bread, a hard-boiled egg, some ersatz coffee bitter and thin. Sugar has become scarce. Butter is rationed. Your walk to the school is short. Outside, the streets are quiet. At the schoolhouse, children gather in orderly lines. They wear uniforms now. Today, you teach mathematics. Safe, quiet, necessary. You keep to the lesson plan exactly. At lunch, you eat in silence. A dry sandwich. A thin soup. You speak only if spoken to. You never ask questions. In the afternoon, a boy no older than 10 asks if he may read aloud. He chooses a state-approved storybook. The language is heavy, clumsy, full of righteousness. You glance toward the window. Outside, the world is unchanged. The trees sway. The sun sits high. When the final bell rings, the children file out in rows. You stay behind to straighten the desks. You walk home slowly, passing the bakery where you once bought warm rolls. Back in your apartment, you remove your jacket and loosen your collar. You read from a letter. It arrived last week. As the sky dims, you prepare a light supper. A bit of boiled potato, a heel of bread. You eat slowly. You chew each bite. In the distance, a dog barks once, then twice, then stops. You sit by the window, looking down at the street. You do not wave. You do not speak. Instead, you pull the shutters closed. You extinguish the candle, and you sit for a moment in the dark, just listening, just surviving, because that, here, is enough. Imagine now a boy named Elias, not a soldier, not a leader, not a criminal, just a boy, 16 years old, living in the year 1941, in the southern reaches of Germany, beneath a sky that seemed, even in the height of summer, to carry a weight heavier than heat alone. He was born to a quiet family. His father worked at a paper mill. His mother sewed garments for neighbors, taking in buttons to be mended, sleeves to be rehemmed, seams to be let out. He liked listening more than speaking, and often sat at the window with his chin resting on the sill, gazing at the street, the faces that passed, the shoes that scuffed pavement, the quiet rituals of an occupied and silenced town. Their home was small, humble, not quite poor, but not far from it. Elias liked books. He liked writing with pencils, sharpened down to stubs. He did not wear a party pin. At night, she would sit beside the small radio, knitting with fingers that moved quickly, even in the dark. She would pause when the national anthem played. She would lower the volume when the speeches came on, because his job at the mill had once been in question, and joining had ensured it would not be again. But enough for him to know it was still there, tucked beneath her breath, like an ember hidden in the ashes. Because a neighbor's cousin had reported another man for speaking too freely, and no one had seen him since. Because sometimes survival looked like agreement, even when it wasn't. They had moved from the city to a smaller village. They had burned old photographs. They had shaved the curls from Elias's hair and taught him to look blank when questions were asked. He stood in assembly and sang the anthem with the others, not so poor as to invite scrutiny. A middle-of-the-road boy, with soft hands and a quiet voice. He saluted. He recited. He watched. And he never, ever let his eyes linger too long on anything. Not the girl 2 seats away. Not the map on the wall with its strange new orders. Not the faces of those who disappeared. His father did. A quiet man with a mustache and lined face. Elias's father had joined the Nazi party not because of belief, but because of exhaustion. Elias often walked the perimeter of town after school, where hedgerows cast narrow shadows and insects, buzzed in the still air. He liked the feeling of movement without destination. He liked pretending, sometimes, that he was someone else entirely, a boy in another time, another country, another world. Not political ones, not dangerous ones, just quiet, wandering tailies. A boy who talked to birds. A girl who lived in a tower of books. He didn't understand most of it, but he recognized the rhythm. A poem, perhaps, or part of a novel. He imagined the place the paper had come from, an English book, in a library with high ceilings, far from ration cards and loudspeakers and red armbands. A man made of mirrors. A smuggled photograph tucked into a brick crevice behind the bakery. These things came to him, it seemed, as though the world were offering fragments of something else. Something beyond. Elias's mother said very little about it. Elias did as he was told. His voice was steady, if quiet. The teacher nodded. A stocky boy, with cropped hair and the pin of the Hitlerjugend on his lapel. And in the stillness that followed, Elias could sometimes hear her whisper a prayer, not loudly, not in Hebrew anymore, because you see, Elias was not a pure Aryan boy. He did not carry the name he had been born with. His family, like many others, had changed names quietly in the years after the early purges. He was, in the terminology of the time, what some called a paper son, a boy whose identity had been gently rewritten, a boy who passed, but passing came with weight, and fear, and silence so thick it stuck in the lungs like smoke, just a name on a paper, a shadow of a boy. Every morning, Elias dressed in his school uniform. He brushed his hair with water to tame the waves. At school, he was average, not so good as to draw envy. He watched the candle burn low and imagined fire taking everything, his stories, his name, his face, his breath, or the next. He kept a notebook, hidden beneath the mattress, where he wrote stories. Each story ended not with triumph, but with stillness. In his stories, no one won, but no one lost either. They simply endured. He wrote late into the night sometimes, careful not to let the pencil scratch too loudly. The walls were thin. The neighbors curious. The summer of 1941 was dry. The fields near their home turned dusty early. One day, on one of those walks, he found something. Still folded his hands behind his back. Still let his eyes wander, only when no one else was watching. The way the sun's heat no longer felt endless, but tender, like a memory softening at the edges. A scrap of paper, folded, caught in the brush. But the silence around it was thicker than any accusation. He returned from the paper mill with his shoulders hunched just slightly more than before. There was a time when he came home with sawdust in his hair and a faint smell of ink on his sleeves. Now he came back with clean hands and tired eyes. In a world of eyes and informants, silence could speak louder than words. He dreamed of a girl with a paper star who could turn herself invisible at will. It was a page from a book, torn, smudged, the text in English. He tucked it into his pocket and said nothing. The shops that once sold things quietly no longer opened at all. Windows were boarded. Families disappeared. Names were erased from school registers. He had learned how to look unremarkable. It was, in many ways, his most important skill. The candle burned shorter. Elias's stories remained in his head, unwritten now. Too risky, but still alive. They wore matching uniforms and caps too big for their heads. They chanted something as they pedaled, laughing as one boy pointed at a window. In his mind, he created whole cities, silent cities, where people walked without watching, where you could speak without consequence, where paper wasn't dangerous and books weren't burned, but borrowed. That night, he read it beneath the blanket by candlelight. He sounded out the words softly, the same one with boarded windows and a painted-over nameplate. But now, the window was cracked, as if someone had broken it again. Inside, The shelves were bare. Dust floated in the beam of late sunlight. He hid the paper beneath his pillow. In the following weeks, he found more. Another scrap in the gutter. A pamphlet in French. A word that marked not just a place, but a person. He never told his parents. They were too tired for hope. One day, in class, the teacher asked each student to stand and recite a passage from the state reader. But later, after class, one of the older boys stopped him in the corridor. "You speak too softly," the boy said. Elias said nothing. "You look down when you talk." Elias kept his hands at his sides. "You think you're better than us?" "No," Elias replied, and it was true. Just holding it, feeling the weight of what lay beneath. In the small stove in the corner of the apartment, he fed the pages one by one into the flames, watching them curl and blacken and disappear. The stories, the dreams, the self that had not yet been stripped away. He didn't think he was better. He didn't think he was anything. The older boy smirked. "We'll see about that." He raised his hand only for arithmetic, never for literature. Nothing happened that day. But a week later, when Elias reached for his school bag after gym class, it had been opened. His notebook was gone. He took Elias's seat at the front of the class. Elias was moved to the back. That night, he didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks. The next morning, nothing was said. No accusations, no announcements. But 2 days later, his teacher pulled him aside and asked where he had been born. Elias answered with the name on his papers. The teacher nodded slowly, then placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Be careful," he said. "These are not times for fiction," and walked away. The summer gave way to autumn slowly that year, as if even the seasons were hesitant to change too fast. Elias noticed it first, not in the trees, but in the air, the way it cooled slightly in the early morning. He still walked the same paths after school, but something had shifted. The page of his storybook had not returned. No one mentioned it. No one called him out or summoned his parents. His father had become quieter too. At dinner, the conversations were practical. The cost of potatoes, a neighbor's new ration card, an announcement on the radio. Elias didn't speak of school. His mother didn't ask. And he would breathe slowly, deeply. In the evenings, the air grew cooler. They became more elaborate. He dreamed of libraries that stretched into the clouds. He dreamed of people who didn't ask questions that hurt. He no longer dreamed of escape. Not truly. He wasn't that foolish. But he dreamed of what peace might feel like. And he wrote it all in silence, with his mind alone. Then came winter. And with it, coldness not just in temperature, but in tone. The air changed in town. Elias felt his own name become heavier. Each time it was called in roll, it rang out like a stone dropped in water echoing deeper than it should have. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He studied. He kept his hands clean, his posture straight, his words clipped. But the world does not always reward silence. Sometimes it calls upon it only to test its strength. One afternoon, while walking home, Elias found himself passing a group of younger boys on bicycles. It was the old bakery, the same one that had been closed since summer. A word had been scratched into the door. Just one word. 5 letters. Elias recognized it immediately. A word that had been scratched across doors before. He stood there a moment too long. One of the boys noticed him. "What are you staring at?" the boy asked. Elias shook his head. "Nothing." The boy tilted his head. "You don't look like you're from here." "I live just down the street," Elias replied. "Your name?" He gave it. The boy said nothing else, just nodded, and pedaled on. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat at the edge of his bed, holding the corner of his mattress, not lifting it, not peeking beneath it. He burned them the next morning, quietly. His mother didn't ask what he was burning. She only closed the window when the smoke drifted too far. Life narrowed after that. His walks shortened. His eyes wandered less. He spoke only when directly addressed. And he waited. He waited for the knock that never came. He waited for the letter that never arrived. He waited for someone to say something. But no one ever did. Because in 1942, silence was the loudest kind of survival. By spring, there were fewer students in his class. Some had moved, some had vanished, some had been removed. The teacher never explained. The classmates never asked. A new boy arrived, blond and eager, with a father in the SS and a voice like a trumpet. He didn't mind. There, near the window, he could see the birds. He could imagine them flying anywhere. Years passed, quietly, unevenly, like drops of water from a cracked faucet. Elias survived. That, in itself, was a story, though no one wrote it down. After the war, after the sirens, the rubble, the absence, the silence turned to noise. He remained, still quiet, still careful. He became a librarian in a town not far from the one where he'd grown up. He collected stories again, not to write them, but to preserve them. He never married. He never spoke of the bakery, or the stories he burned, or the scrap of English paper he once kept beneath his pillow. But some nights, he stood in the library when all was dark, running his fingers along the spines of books, remembering the names that had once been dangerous, not in fear, but in memory, because he had survived, not loudly, but completely. And that, in this world, was a kind of victory all its own. Mystery, archaeology, and culture, the quiet machinery. How truth was slowly replaced in Hitler's Germany. In the gentle hush of a German afternoon in the late 1930s, a small town might seem as peaceful as any other in Europe. Sunlight spilled across roof tiles. Laundry hung lazily from windows, and the distant toll of church bells marked the hours with comforting regularity. But felt in the way people paused before they spoke, in the cautious way glances were exchanged, in the silent pressure behind every word hung unspoken. Soldiers with glowing eyes, mothers with cradles and soft pastel dresses, and always the image of Hitler somewhere above or beside them, watching, guiding, embodying the rhythm of their lives. Biology books now taught the concept of race not as myth or culture, but as fact charts showing superior and inferior traits, lists of characteristics tied to ancestry, equations linking blood to destiny. In some editions, the villain wasn't a wolf or a witch, but someone with a wrong nose, or someone who asked too many questions. But by quiet rules about who to trust, who to doubt, and what it meant to be loyal. Culture in Nazi Germany was not simply background, it was architecture. And propaganda, created and controlled by Joseph Goebbels, a man whose quiet demeanor concealed one of the most calculating minds in modern history. His aim was not only to influence opinion, but to define reality, to determine what people thought was normal, acceptable, beautiful, dangerous, and true. But none of these were chaotic. They moved in unison, like instruments in a symphony. A melody of compliance, drifting gently into the ears of a tired, anxious population desperate for order. Called the People's Receiver, it was deliberately designed to be cheap and limited in frequency. Romantic comedies and children's adventures, made with care and polish. There was no need to fill every frame with violence. It was enough to show a world where certain truths were simply absent. Photographs were selected with care-joyous crowds, diligent workers, radiant mothers. The mood was always hopeful, even when reality was grim. It could not tune into foreign broadcasts. It was meant to be listened to passively, and so it became the soft, constant background to daily life. A subversive poem might fail to get printed. A curious book might never make it past the censor's desk. The silence around these things was often enough. After all, if no one else seemed to miss them, why make a fuss? Columns lined plazas in rows, so straight they seemed to command obedience. The Reich was being built not just in policy, but in stone and shadow, in the way light moved across marble walls at dusk. At the center of it all was a ministry, the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment. To do this, he didn't need to shout. He simply flooded the air. The tools were many posters, films, songs, newspapers, textbooks, theater plays, novels, paintings, and speeches. The posters were bold, almost artistic. They showed idealized families, blonde, clean, smiling, farmers with powerful hands. In schools, the textbooks changed almost overnight. Gone were the pages of global geography, replaced by maps soaked in red and black ink, showing a world encircled by enemies and a homeland burdened with a sacred destiny. Coloring books for children asked them to identify enemy faces. Birthday cards bore nationalistic slogans. Even the calendar shifted. Hitler's birthday became a national celebration, complete with fireworks, school parades, and gifts. Not that it made people zealous, but that it made them tired. People adjusted not because they were convinced, but because resistance felt increasingly impractical. The First World War became a tale of betrayal by internal enemies, until the difference between belief and habit blurred beyond recognition. They study these not just to remember what was said, but to understand what was not allowed to be said. The omissions are as revealing as the rhetoric. Later, it became harsher: an anonymous letter, a quiet arrest, a neighbor disappearing in the night. The economic collapse became the fault of outsiders. The present became a march toward greatness. And the future, always just out of reach, was painted as perfect, if only a few more sacrifices were made. Even the fairy tale has changed. The Brothers Grimm, once cherished for their rich tapestry of folklore, were rewritten to emphasize duty, obedience, and sacrifice. A child might have gone to sleep listening to such stories, their dreams shaped not by magic. Radio, too, became an invisible teacher. Radios were subsidized by the regime's small, affordable units placed in kitchens, living rooms, cafes, and classrooms. Even when the volume was low, the voice of the Reich never left the room. And yet, most chilling of all, it was often beautiful. The propaganda was not crude. It was not always aggressive. Often, it was subtle, poetic even. Songs full of longing for homeland. Films with breathtaking cinematography. And once something becomes absent long enough, it begins to feel unnecessary. In this way, truth was not destroyed. It was displaced. Old ideas were pushed gently to the side. History was rewritten slowly, then quickly. The press, once diverse and unpredictable, was reduced to a single chorus. Newspaper editors were replaced. Independent journals vanished. Headlines began to rhyme. Dissenting voices were not always arrested. Sometimes they were just ignored. A satirical play might open and close in the same week. Even architecture bent to the will of illusion. New buildings in Berlin were designed to be monumental, their scale dwarfing the individual. Streets widened, statues rose, and within homes, culture trickled through less visibly. Games were redesigned to teach ideological lessons. The cost of questioning was subtle at first: an awkward pause, a lost job, a reassigned post. But the foundation had already been laid. By then, people had already learned to look away, not with malice, not always with fear, but with weariness. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of the regime's cultural propaganda, not that it inspired passion, but that it created resignation. In public squares, festivals still took place. Music still played. Bread was baked. Couples danced. But beneath it all was a vacuum, a void where truth once lived. And in that vacuum, the state planted new truths, carefully, tenderly, repeatedly. Even today, historians and archivists uncover pieces of that machinery, fragments of pamphlets, rewritten textbooks, film reels stored in forgotten boxes. For in the culture of Hitler's Germany, silence was not a lack of noise. It was an instrument, and it played a song that millions did not realize they were humming until it was too late to stop. Segment 4, Part 1, Life Below. The ordinary German household. Imagine yourself stepping into a modest German household in the year 1943. The door opens with a faint creak. The air inside is cool, still. A pot of cabbage simmers on the stove fin, mostly water now. A child's coat hangs near the door, patched at the elbows. A wooden radio sits on a shelf, silent for the moment. And beside the window, a mother folds laundry, hands dry from scrubbing with rationed soap. Heat came from a stove in the kitchen, which also served as the center of the home. Furniture was plain, often repurposed from earlier times. Walls were bare or adorned with modest pictures, sometimes landscapes, occasionally portraits of family members in uniform. This was the world of the ordinary German under the Third Reich. The hem of a dress, carefully let down to fit a growing child. A shoe repaired twice, then again. A larder with fewer jars than the year before. Butter, when it could be had, came in small wrapped rectangles, stamped and accounted for. Not the banners, not the parades, not the salutes. Schools encouraged them to report conversations, to join the Hitler Youth, to chant and recite and absorb. But the small daily details of getting by. The house was likely built decades before brick or stone, solid but unremarkable. Maybe a single friend. But even then, caution was king. Friends disappeared. Accidents happened. Letters arrived with black stamps and bureaucratic finality. If you looked closely, you'd see quiet signs of strain. Food rationing was one of the most constant aspects of life. The announcement of more conscriptions, and the telegrams, folded, gray, heavy, waiting, rationing, repairing, mourning and prodded. It didn't arrive as a shock. It settled in slowly, expanding its grip as the war dragged on. Every family had a booklet of coupons. Bicycles replaced buses. Bartering replaced markets. A chicken's egg might be traded for a bit of soap. A coat mended in exchange for potatoes. And because alternatives were not visible, or came with costs too great to bear, to queue patiently for whatever was left on the shelf. Why wouldn't he survive a day in Hitler's Germany? Written in calm, paragraph-based format with rich details and extended length. Talking over dinner gave way to chewing in thought. The taste of salt or spice became a memory. It is not a scene of devastation, but it is tired, hollowed, structured, and the fear seemed like distant rulers, even as they defined the daily lives of the majority. It was not merely wealth that separated the elite from the common folk. It was distance, access, and curated illusion. The stone of the house is clean, pale, and polished, not worn by age, but maintained constantly by workers who rarely speak unless spoken to. Soft classical music plays from a gramophone. A crystal decanter rests half-empty beside a glass, next to untouched books arranged by spine color on handmade shelves. Points for bread, milk, meat, fats. Each visit to the grocer involved careful calculations. A parallel existence propped up by the labor, silence, and suffering of the rest. Their meals came not from markets, but from private deliveries. Trains carrying soldiers and refugees stopped for inspections, for labor checks, but also to deliver wine to private parties hosted in the villas of senior party officials. The Nazi elite held parties in castles, dined beneath chandeliers, toasted to imagined victories, and gave speeches heavy with certainty and delusion. A family of 5 learned how to make do with portions meant for 3. They cooked, cleaned, arranged, and disappeared into corners. They were present, yet unseen. The elite barely noticed the movement of hands that kept their lives pristine. Their birthdays were not postponed because of food shortages or air raids. Their futures were not questions, they were plans. No, these children were groomed as the next generation of rulers. These institutions trained not thinkers, but believers. Boys who would one day command. Girls who would bear future commanders. The world outside was seldom mentioned, unless as a warning. They had horseback lessons, private tutors, summer retreats in the Alps, carefully selected literature, and parents who spoke to them of destiny. They were uniforms of authority, yes, but also of vanity. Some days there was no meat. Other days, a neighbor might share a boiled bone for broth. Meals were slow, quiet affairs. A whisper disappeared into a file. A name fell off the list. Yet it wasn't hunger alone that burdened the average family. He is perhaps reviewing reports, letters, movements of people movements that will never touch his own family or his dinner plans. It was vigilance, not in the form of overt threats, but in constant self-checking. These contracts were not just profitable. They were protection. As long as they delivered, they were safe. Safe from scrutiny, from rationing, from the discomforts of the world they helped design. They feared being outmaneuvered politically. They feared the waning of favor. Real coffee, imported cigarettes, silk, Italian shoes, Norwegian butter. They feared falling a notch within the hierarchy, not because of conscience, but because power was everything. Hitler's own mountaintop compound, the Berghof, offered a view that stretched across the Austrian Alps, a view he enjoyed with diplomats and filmmakers, sipping tea, posing for photos, signing decrees that reshaped the continent below. Was the curtain drawn before the father spoke of his opinion? A wife, perhaps, who asked where the neighbor's child had gone. A secretary who hesitated while typing a report. A junior officer who stared too long at a transport list. Did the child repeat something overheard in school? Did the neighbor linger too long at the mailbox? Some stood trial. Many did not. Some re-entered society, changed names, started companies. Others vanished behind closed doors into history's soft fog. Cities collapsed. Train lines crumbled. But private roads to alpine retreats remained cleared. While the public walked miles to stand in line for bread, the elite dined in salons with linen napkins and table service. Children were a particular risk innocent, yet highly trained in the art of national loyalty. A mother might kiss her son goodnight, then lie awake wondering what he might tell his instructor the next day. Trust lived in a narrow circle family, perhaps. And then there was the war. The distant sound of aircraft. A ever closer news of fighting. For many German women, the war meant absence. Husbands, brothers, sons gone, some to the front, some to factories, some vanished entirely. Life narrowed to endurance. Jobs changed, too. Many women who had not worked outside the home now found themselves in munitions factories or offices. Children grew up fast. They learned to sew, to fetch water. Yet despite the hardship, most did not resist. Not because they agreed, but because survival required obedience. Imagine walking through a town street. You pass women pulling carts of wood, children in too thin jackets, a man pausing outside a closed shop. And beneath every footstep lies a quiet resignation life lived within invisible walls. This was the reality for millions. Not spectacular terror, but the daily erosion of comfort, connection, and truth. Life above, the world of Nazi elites. A long, immersive continuation of segment 4 for boring history for sleep. While the ordinary citizens of Germany lined up for turnips, rationed soap, and coal scraps, there existed another world, one just above and yet immeasurably far away. This was the world of Nazi elites. To walk into that world was to enter a reality so insulated, so meticulously arranged that the war, the hunger. Let us gently wander now through this other Germany, where titles held more weight than ration books, and where obedience was not demanded, but expected as the natural order of things. Imagine a grand estate outside of Munich, the early evening light casting a golden hue across manicured lawns and vine-covered facades. Inside, the air is scented faintly with cigar smoke, wool, and something floral, perhaps a carefully placed vase of lily beside a portrait of the Führer. A man in a sharply pressed uniform lounges in a leather chair. He is not fighting. He is not rationing. This man, and others like him, lived in a Germany of excess. Their salaries were generous. Their homes were requisitioned from the displaced. The uniforms worn by Nazi leadership were tailored by professionals' sharp lines, hand-stitched collars, custom insignias that spoke more of fashion than of function. Even as cities like Hamburg and Cologne suffered bombings, even as children in Berlin crawled into cellars during air raids. Their homes often included servants' domestic workers, either loyal by conviction or coerced by survival. Some came from occupied territories, others from minority communities forced into labor. And in these homes, children were raised with care, with privilege, and with curated narratives. They were not the boys in worn boots scraping ice from their windows or the girls carrying water in chipped buckets. Their games involved flags and naps, not ration tokens. At schools for elite children, such as those run by the Nazi Party or the SS, the focus was discipline, ideology, physical perfection. And while cities smoldered, these isolated institutions flourished. Some elites had their own private trains, their own orchestras, their own retreats in the Bavarian forests. For the powerful, war was not horror. It was strategy. They spoke not of grief, but of logistics. They moved people, not knowing or pretending not to know what happened to them after. And when dissent arose, they did not argue. They simply replaced. A troublesome officer vanished. A newspaper changed hands. The elite held the levers of this quiet machinery, and they did not worry about getting crushed beneath it. Even their fear was different. While ordinary Germans feared bombs, food shortages, arrests, or whispers, the elite feared irrelevance. Some elite families built entire fortunes on contracts awarded by the Nazi state building roads, manufacturing uniforms, designing bunkers. They had chauffeurs, access to unreleased films, priority on luxury items even during war, and always guards at their gates. As the war progressed and conditions worsened for everyone else, the separation grew more obscene. There were those within the elite who questioned quietly, but questioning rarely led to change. More often, it led to reassignment, or silence, or complicity. Because at the highest levels, truth was not useful, it was dangerous. In the end, many of the elite fled, forged papers, hid their roles, or claimed ignorance. And yet their children remembered. The estates, the car rides, the uniforms, the music. They remembered a world untouched by the noise outside. A world above, built on the quiet obedience of those below. Resistance, risk, and reluctant silence. Part 1. Beneath the surface. Ordinary people. Extraordinary risk. A long, immersive narrative of subtle resistance and internal conflict in a tightly controlled society. Written in the calm, soothing, and emotionally reflective tone of boring history for sleep. Her fingers traced the soft edges of the pages, though her eyes remained fixed on the curtained window, listening not for anything in particular, but because that is what people do in such times, targeting over 20,000 characters. In a small apartment on the third floor of a narrow building in Leipzig, a young woman sits beside a gas lamp, a book opened on her lap but unread. They listen for footsteps. Her father once taught Latin at the university. He no longer teaches. His lectures were deemed too speculative. The family said nothing. They simply stopped talking about it. They listened for knocks. They listened for the absence of sound, which can be louder than noise. She walks quietly, politely, keeping her voice low in public, her gaze carefully neutral. But at night, she listens to a radio she's not supposed to own, one tuned carefully, precisely, to a foreign frequency that fades in and out like a whisper across water. Her name is Clara. She is 23. She works at a post office by day. Clara does not attend rallies. She does not wear the armband. This act of listening is enough to risk arrest, and she knows it. You see, the idea of resistance in Nazi Germany has often been painted in broad, dramatic strokes, bearing plots, bombings, assassinations. But for most people, for those like Clara, resistance was not about action. It was about hesitation, about choice, about moments of not clapping loudly enough, of pausing before repeating a slogan. His hands are stained with grease, his back bent from years of labor. The factory is loud, hot, and filled with posters urging diligence, discipline, sacrifice, of not reporting a joke. He remembers the Weimar years, the hunger, yes, but also the freedom. Now he speaks only when spoken to. At lunch, he sits alone. Of asking one question too many. The curriculum has changed, again more emphasis on racial theory, less on literature. She sighs and begins with mathematics. When he is told to report on a coworker for being insufficiently enthusiastic, he claims ignorance. These were quiet resistances, and they were dangerous, because the system did not need your belief. She reads poetry aloud, carefully selecting verses about reflection, choice, and unseen courage. The children do not always understand, but something settles in their minds like dust on a bookshelf, quiet and persistent. It needed your silence. Let us travel slowly through this world, now not of soldiers or statesmen, but of those caught in the web, quietly questioning, carefully enduring. In a factory on the edge of Dresden, Hans, a machinist in his 40s, works 12-hour shifts assembling parts for military trucks. But she keeps his handwriting in a small notebook, tucked beneath her mattress. Sophie, it is said, stood calmly, hands folded, and said, "Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter, if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Hans once voted for the Social Democrats. He is not a hero. He does not distribute pamphlets. But every now and then, when a machine part fails and no one notices, he does not report it. Most are forgotten now. Their names were lost, their work buried. These are his rebellions. They change nothing. Others preach subtle sermons, speaking in metaphors, weaving defiance into parables. Not dramatic manifestos. Just words, questions, facts, appeals to reason. They left them in public places. Eventually, he was arrested. He would die before the war's end. Others fled, falsified papers, changed names. Children were sent away to strangers. Letters were coded. Rings of supporters worked in silence, passing information, food, and hope. But his writings endured, and his quiet, firm refusal to bow became a light for others, in preserving what little dignity the state had not yet confiscated. On benches, in corridors, near lecture halls, but they preserved something within him. In Munich, a school teacher named Frau Stein closes the blinds before writing the lesson plan on the board, but she lets the children read Goethe when the inspector is absent, to remember what had been forbidden to remember, to hope when hope itself had been outlawed. Frau Stein's brother was taken last year. For what, she does not know. She does not speak of him. Even in this world, even surrounded by ideology, she preserves a sliver of another world, one made of words, thought, and quiet memory. Not all resistance was passive. What they could ignore, and what they could not. Across Germany, a network of students, thinkers, clerics, and workers began to stir, not as one movement, but as dozens of small, flickering efforts. But some we remember. The White Rose. A group of university students in Munich, Sophie and Hans Schall among them, who began printing leaflets. They knew the risks. When they were caught, the trial was quick. The sentence was death. But in those final hours, they did not recant. She was 21. This was resistance too. Not loud, not long, but complete. Then there were the clergy. Some priests and pastors refused to merge their churches with the Reich. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor and theologian, was one such voice. He joined a resistance movement. He wrote letters. He helped Jews escape. The streetlights below glow amber against the cobblestones. Footsteps pass in rhythm. Just a simple sheet of paper. An unsent letter. A sentence that might be recorded and never delivered. A thought written because speaking it would be too dangerous. Even when the consequences were unbearable, even when speaking might mean the loss of everything, the mind sometimes demanded release. He could be any number of men and women during the Third Reich, those who each night returned from their government job or factory or classroom and sat at a desk with a pen and a choice. But the room itself remained still, shielded by drawn curtains, papered walls, and a silence that feels careful, cultivated, to mentors buried or vanished. Bonhoeffer once said, "Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." The old Jewish woman who used to wave to my children is gone. I did not ask where. I could not. No one does. But every time I pass her window, I imagine her inside, folding her things, being told to leave. And I said nothing. It begins with ordinary observations, the weather, the harvest, a sick neighbor, and then slips into something more raw. Because to tell the truth in such a time, even only to oneself, was a kind of defiance. A witness writing not to change the world, but to mark that the truth had once lived inside them, however briefly. But most people could not act, not in such ways. Their resistance was internal, in private choices, in small refusals. Among Jewish Germans, resistance took a different shape, one of desperation and courage in equal measure. In cities, some went into hiding attics, basements, forest shelters. Each act, no matter how small, carried immense weight. A knock on the wrong door could mean death. Yet still, they resisted, not just through sabotage, but through survival. To teach a child, to light a candle, to write a name on a hidden wall, these became acts of defiance. And even among those who did not resist, there was conflict. The woman who turned in her neighbor, but cried as she signed the paper. Your exhibits reviewed by censors, who cared not about form, technique, or color, but only symbolism. To depict a figure with ambiguity could lead to blacklisting. The boy who saluted in school, but felt hollow when he looked at his Jewish classmate's empty desk. The factory manager who read the quotas, stamped the orders, but could no longer sleep. He turned to smaller canvases, painting tiny portraits of his friends before they vanish, tucking them inside the walls of his home. He signed them with initials only. When the house was demolished decades later, 23 faces were found, pressed beneath plaster. These were not heroes, but they were not monsters either. Plays written in rural dialects, where the villain was a wolf, but clearly stood for something else. They were human-trapped, afraid, and unsure. Resistance in Nazi Germany was not just about opposition. It was about conscience, about what people could bear, what they could live with. People were imprisoned for such things. But for many, laughter, even brief, brittle laughter, was a form of rebellion. It is tempting, from the safety of hindsight, to imagine we would have done better. But history is not a test. It is a mirror, and it shows us that bravery is rarely loud, rarely clean. It is often tired, trembling, and quiet. There were entire underground seminary programs, training ministers in secret, knowing they might never stand in a pulpit freely. It shows us that to live in a regime that punishes thought is not just difficult, it is disorienting. He was warned, then threatened, eventually removed. But the plaque remained untouched, quietly visible above the baptismal font. That over time, even truth becomes heavy to carry. And yet, again and again, someone picked it up. A woman, a student, a priest, a mechanic, a child. One by one, in silence, and often in darkness, they resisted. Who said nothing when questions were asked, and less when they were pressed. And because of them, the light did not go out completely. Part 2, Whispers Against the Wind. The burden of knowing and the danger of speaking. The candle flame flickers slightly as you picture a room, a narrow room, high in a quiet building overlooking the darker side of Berlin. There is a man seated at a desk in this imagined room. His name is not important, not a dramatic choice. No bombs, no tunnels, no coded messages. And still, they wrote. They wrote because the burden of knowing, of understanding what was happening beyond the daily broadcasts, beyond the edited newspapers, was too heavy to carry in silence forever. And so, in the quiet rooms of Nazi Germany, people wrote letters they would never send. After the fall, when the truth emerged not in triumphant declarations, but in questions, to siblings abroad, to lovers lost. These documents, found later in attics and basements, or hidden behind crumbling walls, offer us a different resistance, not heroic in the traditional sense, but incredibly brave in its honesty. One such letter, dated 1942, was discovered in a village outside Hamburg, behind the loose panel of an old armoire. They have taken all the names off the mailbox across the street. There's no call to action, no rebellion, just acknowledgement. Across the country, similar moments occurred, quiet flashes of discomfort that were rarely spoken but deeply felt. In offices, someone hesitated before typing a name. In factories, a mechanic added a flaw to a part, praying it would never function. In kitchens, a wife lowered her voice before asking her husband if he'd heard the rumors. In train stations, someone looked away, not out of cruelty, but shame. The weight of complicity did not fall all at once. It arrived in pieces. First, in the changing textbooks. Then, in the shop that quietly changed hands. In the friend who is no longer mentioned. It is not a tale of overcoming. It is a record of survival of moral threads held between trembling fingers. In the church pew left empty. At each stage, people told themselves it was temporary, or necessary, or inevitable. And in that slow erosion of conscience, resistance became not a single act, but a million tiny decisions made in private. Imagine being an artist in that time, your canvases scrutinized. To paint a tree that leaned the wrong way could be suspect. And yet, some still painted, in abstract ways, with coded symbols, with chosen colors that hinted at sorrow or pride or memory. One artist in Cologne continued to paint despite being forbidden from showing his work. Not one was smiling. Each bore the soft, shadowed weight of someone who had seen too much. Writers, too, found ways to slip past the net. Short stories printed in obscure journals where metaphors replaced politics. And then there were the jokes. Yes, even under dictatorship, humor persisted. Not loud, not public, but whispered. Jokes became code tools to recognize like mines. A well-timed glance and a half-finished pun could tell someone you saw the world differently. It was dangerous, yes, because laughter resists fear, and fear was the regime's most potent weapon. In churches, the tension between faith and fascism grew quietly, like moss along an old stone wall. Some clergy embraced the new order. They saw alignment, discipline, control. They modified sermons to fit the doctrine. Others did not. There were priests and pastors who continued to preach against injustice, even when congregants reported them. One pastor outside of Stuttgart refused to remove a plaque honoring Jewish members of his congregation lost in the First World War. It wasn't defiance with trumpets. It was resistance through memory. And what of the neighbors? The ones who hid families in cellars, who passed food through fence slats. These acts did not happen often, but they did happen. In some towns, entire networks formed, not formal, not named, but built from glances, gestures, shared risks. A butcher would deliver meat no longer on the list. A teacher would look the other way when roll call came up short. A train worker would adjust logs by one line just enough to make someone vanish less easily. The impact of these small acts is hard to measure, but they meant everything to those they helped. And they remind us that resistance is not always about overthrowing systems. It is about preserving the humanity those systems aim to erase. Then there were the moments after the war. Who knew what? Who said nothing? Who believed? Who doubted? Who chose survival over truth? And were they wrong to do so? These are not questions for judgment. They are questions for reflection, because it is easy, from a distance, to imagine courage. Harder, from inside, to live it. And yet, again and again, someone did. Not always perfectly, not always successfully, but persistently, quietly, bravely. In the end, the story of resistance in Hitler's Germany is not one of grand victories. It is the story of those who knew the wind was blowing in a terrible direction, and who, despite being alone, afraid, and unheard, chose to whisper anyway. They did not stop the storm. But their voices are why we still know it came. The long shadow, legacy, memory, and the weight of silent choices. It begins, as many things do in history, not with shouting or sirens, but with silence. A heavy, cautious silence that falls over a generation that survived, endured, and looked back with more questions than answers. It lived in the spaces between conversations, in the faded photographs tucked into drawers, in the eyes of men and women who still hesitated when the knock came at the door, even if that knock no longer meant danger. For many who lived through the years of the Nazi regime, survival itself became an act of quiet resistance. But the emotional weight, the burden of the Nazi years, lingered in both. She kept his last letter in a shoebox, rereading it only when alone. There was the teacher in Dusseldorf who each year lit a candle on the same day, but never explained why. There was the grocer who refused to sell a certain brand of chocolate because it reminded him of something he would never say aloud. These were small choices, but they mattered. In public squares, they were not always comfortable. They were often halting, but they happened. Slowly, Germany became a country willing, perhaps more than any other, to face its darkest chapter. But not all at once, and not without resistance. It is in the school children who visit camps and write poems afterward. It is in the conversations held at kitchen tables, in the questions asked, and in the answers finally given. She interviewed survivors, and she told that story again and again, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. For there were those who still clung to the old myths, who preferred the comfort of forgetfulness to the challenge of memory. A granddaughter asked her grandmother why a certain neighbor's house was always kept locked, why no one ever moved in. The grandmother paused, then sighed. She told the girl about the family who had lived there, the Kaufmans. A Jewish family. Friends. One day, they were simply gone. She had not said goodbye. She had not asked where they went. And she had never, until that moment, spoken their names again. And so, the work of resistance continued, not against a regime, but against forgetting. In the West, Reconstruction brought new buildings, new alliances, and a desire to move forward. They asked questions that fell like soft rain into still rooms. Where was Grandpa during the war? Survivor testimonies recorded, but this took time, decades, in some cases. For many years, the focus remained on economic recovery, on political stability. And for many Germans, The full weight of what had happened came slowly, like fog creeping across a landscape. It wasn't that they didn't know. It was that knowing fully would mean facing parts of themselves and their families they weren't sure they could. Who questioned the need to remember so fully, so often? But history has shown us what happens when memory fails. And so, in the soft murmur of museum tours, in the quiet writing of memoirs, in the folding of letters into archives, the work of resistance endures. Why don't we talk about that time? Who lived in that house before us? Some parents answered with vague words, others with none at all. But the questions persisted. Faces, hundreds of them. Young, old, smiling, stern, unknown. Beneath each one, a name, a date, sometimes a place, sometimes only a question mark. In the East, the past was often repainted with ideological brushes, woven into communist narratives, by telling, by remembering, and also those who resisted by breaking rules, by hiding someone, by asking a dangerous question at the wrong time. And yes, also those who resisted too late or never, but whose descendants now ask, now speak, now remember. But beneath both, the personal stories, the quiet, difficult ones, remained the same. And the aftermath, the years that followed, were filled not with dramatic reckonings, but with slow, gentle confrontations, with memory, with conscience, with silence. Imagine now a small room, dimly lit, with dust caught in the air like soft, slow-moving snow. Let the weight of these stories settle around you, not heavy, but grounding. Let the names you've heard tonight drift gently through your mind. Let the candlelight of memory flicker, soft and constant. No guide for how to live in a world where the unthinkable had happened, and where millions had watched or turned away or tried in their own small ways. And not only of those who were taken, but of what was lost inside them, the trust, the certainty, the youthful belief that the world could be understood. And so, many said nothing, at least not at first. Instead, they planted gardens again, painted walls, held funerals, buried things some physical, some emotional, to push back. The people who remained, who stepped into the quiet days after 1945, did not all consider themselves heroes. Chose to tell, chose to resist, quietly, bravely. Most did not consider themselves anything. They were tired, changed, uncertain, monitored, gradually shaped by an invisible hand. A husband might come home and mention a new policy at work. The state encouraged racially pure unions and discouraged those that crossed ethnic lines. Couples were sometimes required to prove their lineage through family documents, going back generations before a marriage license could be approved. Love, once private, now required paperwork. The state sought to reshape faith to its purposes, to replace the cross with the swastika in people's hearts. In homes, families continued to pray before meals, read from worn Bibles, whisper hymns as lullabies. These, too, became delicate. The regime encouraged reporting. Citizens were urged to share information about un-German behavior. Children were praised for turning in their parents. Students were rewarded for exposing teachers. They simply existed under a new weight, a new tension, like leaves floating on a slow, dark current. He kisses his wife's cheek, says little. The children stir, half awake. They hold on to small acts of independence, baking a recipe from their grandmother, saying grace before bed, speaking their native dialect when alone. Full of whispered love, cautious hope, and the quiet strength of those who refuse, if only in their hearts, to give everything away. These things seem small, but in a world where conformity is demanded, they are quietly profound. There's a softness to the moment, a quiet dignity in survival. They eat together, they smile, faintly. Tomorrow will come, and they will endure. Gossip, once harmless, could now lead to interrogation. As a result, many learned to speak carefully even at home. Jokes were whispered, opinions kept private. Sometimes, even thoughts were left unspoken. Some congregations met in secret when their buildings were closed. The idea that a man and a woman, husband and wife, might sit across from each other at the dinner table and wonder if the other would keep a secret. That parents might watch their child recite party slogans and wonder if they had already lost them to something larger, something unreachable. In Hitler's Germany, these were not paranoid fantasies. They were daily truths. And yet, in the midst of it all, life continued. Some pastors continued to preach the gospel of love, justice, and humility, knowing it could cost them everything. Faith, like love, became an act of resistance when it refused to conform. Churches were pressured to conform. Pastors who resisted were watched, silenced, or worse. Sermons were expected to support the state's values, not question them. For those with Jewish ancestry or uncertain heritage, love became a liability, a danger. A wife might return from church and note a change in the sermon. In the long, quiet look between two people who knew their relationship could never be public. There were German women who loved Jewish men, and men who married foreign-born wives before the laws forbade it. There were marriages that remained strong through silence, and others that broke under the pressure of fear. The regime did not destroy love, but it certainly meant it, forced it into shapes that were quieter, more secretive, and often more painful. A neighbor's child might come by and, with innocent confusion, ask why the family doesn't display a flag. These were not accusations, not yet, but they were signals. Reminders that the personal and the political could no longer be cleanly divided. The regime was not only a force that governed parades, laws, and war. It was something that crept into homes, folded itself into marriages, whispered between siblings, and altered the way love, trust, and faith were expressed. For the average German family, the walls no longer belonged solely to them. They belonged, in part, to the state. The war has ended. The regime has crumbled. But the echoes have not. They remain etched in memories, habits, and the quiet ways people choose to tell, or not tell, their stories. In the aftermath of Hitler's Germany, resistance did not vanish. It changed shape. It became subtle, interior, reflective. There were no instruction manuals for what came next. In kitchens and bedrooms, attics and basements, people began to take stock, not of victories, but of losses. In the years that followed, Germany split into two divided by borders, ideologies, and histories. There was the woman in Hamburg who never told her children that their uncle had been arrested in 1938 for speaking out. The buildings outside are dark, windows mostly shuttered, and the lamps burn low to conserve fuel. Within the apartment, a mother sits near the stove, warming a small pot of soup. Her husband has not yet returned from his day at the factory, and their children are in bed, tucked beneath patched wool blankets. The apartment is quiet, except for the soft creaking of old wood and the occasional snap of heat from the stove. The mother watches the steam rise, absently stirring. Her mind, however, is not here. It is far away, drifting through worry, calculation, silence. And then there were the children, the post-war generation, those who grew up amid rubble and rebuilding, who inherited not only cities but silences. In schools, history was taught carefully, then more openly. Museums were built, documents collected. Over time, though, the conversations began. In living rooms, in lecture halls. And that, perhaps, is the quiet truth that emerged in the decades after the war, that the final and most enduring form of resistance is remembrance. It is in the small brass stones laid in sidewalks, bearing the names of the taken. One such conversation took place in 1978 in a modest home in Nuremberg. The granddaughter, silent, listened. She would never forget that moment. Years later, she became a historian. She wrote books. In remembering, she resisted. And so, too, did thousands of others, each in their own way. Some lit candles on anniversaries. Some documented family trees, including the missing branches. Some volunteered at museums or worked to preserve fading records. Some simply told their children and asked them to remember. This was resistance without violence. Resistance without banners. Resistance through tenderness, through truth. It took courage. Still does. For even now, as the decades pass, there are those who'd rather forget. And it is work. Gentle work. Slow work. But vital. Because memory is not passive. It is active. It must be chosen, maintained, defended. Just as silence, once, was a tool of the regime, so now speech honest, painful, reflective speech becomes a tool of freedom. As this segment draws to a close, imagine, if you will, standing in front of a wall of photographs. These are the faces of those who resisted by surviving. History, after all, is not made only by those in power, but by those who endure. And you sitting quietly, listening gently, perhaps drifting now toward rest, you too are part of that chain. By learning, by remembering, by honoring. The past does not demand guilt, only honesty, only care, only presence. So let us stay a moment longer in this space of reflection. And know this, even in the darkest times, someone, somewhere chose to remember. As you sleep tonight, perhaps you carry a little of that light forward, not in protest, not in anger, but in peace, in stillness, in remembrance. Segment 6. Private lives under the regime. Love, marriage, faith, and fear. Whispers in the kitchen. Prayers behind closed doors. It is evening now in a modest German apartment, somewhere in Dresden, perhaps, or Cologne. In the Third Reich, the concept of a private life was fragile. It was not destroyed entirely, but it was watched. This influence did not arrive suddenly. It was not a storm. It was a slow pressure, a tightening. Consider marriage. Under Hitler's regime, marriage was not simply a personal vow. It was a matter of national importance. And yet, love persisted, in hidden letters, in meetings at train stations. Then there was religion. In theory, the Nazi regime tolerated Christianity. Many of its members were nominal Christians. But the truth was more complex. Still, many believers clung to their old faith, quietly, cautiously. And what of friendship? What of trust between neighbors? There is something quietly terrifying in that, isn't there? People still celebrated birthdays. Children still played games. Couples still walked hand in hand beneath the autumn trees. The ordinary moments of life did not disappear. In the kitchen, the soup is ready. The husband returns, his coat dusted with soot. But in their hearts, in the sacred space where the regime cannot reach, they remember who they were before. This is what private life looked like under the Third Reich. Not always dramatic, not always heroic, but deeply human. The interior war, loneliness, womanhood, and the politics of the bedroom. Imagine now the slow rhythm of another morning in 1942. A soft fog presses against the window panes of a modest apartment nestled on the 4th floor of an old building in Frankfurt. Inside, the air is quiet, heavy with the scent of damp wood and boiled potatoes. A small radio hums faintly in the corner, German classical music drifting through static, but no one is really listening. The breakfast table is mostly bare. A half loaf of rye bread sits on a chipped plate. The mother slices carefully, rationing each piece with silent calculation. Many women did not want or could not afford to stay home. They worked in offices, shops, factories. She is 34, with tired hands and a voice she has learned to lower. She praises the Führer when her neighbor listens, nods during school meetings, avoids questions. She no longer prays aloud. Her church was closed months ago, and the new one feels different, closer to a rally than a sanctuary. She still believes in God, though she no longer says so outside her home. Women were urged to bear many children, especially those considered racially pure. Awards were given for large families. Bronze, silver, gold. They were pitied, judged, or quietly ignored. Their value, in the eyes of the state, diminished. Some were labeled asocial or degenerate, their names added to lists. Their futures quietly closed off. But these honors came with costs: financial, physical, emotional. Access to contraception was restricted. Abortion, in most cases, was criminalized. Women found themselves trapped between public praise and private exhaustion. Her husband was conscripted last year. She lives now with her 2 sons and her aging mother-in-law. Each day is a calculation of rations, of time, of emotion. They remembered cafes filled with laughter, with argument, with jazz music. But at home, if one listened closely, one could still hear the lullabies of the old world sung softly, cautiously, but still sung. They remembered books, art, questions. And though they rarely spoke of it now, that memory lived on. Not as nostalgia, but as quiet contrast. Not loud, not organized, but persistent. A mother who teaches her daughter to bake her grandmother's bread. A father who explains history differently than the textbook. They are the shape of a people's interior life, under pressure, quiet, enduring, and deeply human. A grandmother who still lights a candle each week, even if the curtains are drawn tight. A small world of connection that resisted the flattening force of state ideology. Mud clings to the cobbled lanes, and patches of snow still linger in the shadows of crumbling barns. Her 2 sons were drafted in '44. One came home, limping and silent. The other did not. For months, she said little. In long, tentative conversations between siblings, between neighbors. Some homes had been taken by neighbors during the regime's organized expropriations. Others stood empty, boarded, as if waiting. But habits learned in fear die slowly. Many continued to speak in code, to meet discreetly, to measure every glance. Trust does not grow quickly in the soil of oppression. How does one name pain when pain has no safe name? In these spaces, the return to normal life was complicated by absence, the teacup left behind. Across Germany, in cities large and small, survivors of private wars, women, men, children began to rebuild not only walls and roads, but ways of being. The pain too deep, the past too tangled. There are diaries filled with half-finished sentences, letters never sent, photographs without names. A reminder that survival is not always triumphant. Sometimes it is quiet, exhausted, worn thin. But still it is survival. Each one bears the name of someone who was taken, someone whose private life ended under the weight of the regime. These stones are not grand monuments. They do not shout, not in rebellion, but in tenderness, not in slogans, but in stories. In the way, a granddaughter asks her grandmother what she did during the war and listens, without judgment, the dim kitchens, the shared beds, the whispered prayers, the laughter that had to be hidden, and the grief that could not. These were the homes of Hitler's Germany. And while the regime sought to shape them, it never fully succeeded. In the way, a family keeps a photograph on the mantel, not of a soldier, but of a woman peeling potatoes by the window, a boy reading in the corner. Something quietly, defiantly human. They simply sit there, at foot level, reminding passers-by that the past lived here, that it had a name, a dinner table, a song, a laugh, a fear, bread still rising, lights still flickering, and souls tired, yes, but still unbroken. And within it, the seeds of something more. Some had embraced those roles, others had tolerated them, others still had resisted quietly. But now the framework was gone, and so they redefined themselves, not all at once, but slowly, in going back to school, in working outside the home again, in choosing whether or not to marry, whether or not to have children. These were not merely personal choices. They were acts of subtle resistance against the roles that had once been assigned to them. Mothers returned to mothering without fear of the party's gaze. And in that truth, there is comfort. These were the questions of bakers, of teachers, of midwives and grocers: to love freely, to speak honestly, to question, to refuse. People whose lives had unfolded largely in private, in spaces that the regime tried but could never fully control. And it was in those private spaces that a new Germany slowly began to take shape, not in speeches, but in meals shared, in lullabies hummed, in gardens planted. Fathers returned home, some broken, some hardened, some simply older than their years. Young people, shaped by education, designed to mold them into obedient tools of the state, found themselves asking questions for which they had no framework. The marks on a child's bedroom wall, the memories shared and unshared. In the way children asked questions now, wide-eyed, curious, hungry for truth their parents weren't always ready to give. Some households chose silence protective, dense, almost impenetrable. Others let memory flow freely, weeping into photo albums, clinging to stories half remembered. But now, in this strange, uncertain peace, she begins to move through her house again with quiet purpose. She dusts shelves, stitches new curtains from old linens, plants onions in a small patch of earth behind the cottage. In these acts, small, repetitive, humble, there is something like healing. In a modest home just outside the town square, a woman named Anna opens her windows for the first time in months. The glass is cracked in places, the frame swollen from years of condensation, but the air outside smells faintly of green. She lets it in. These were not grand acts of rebellion, but they were, in their own way, defiant. She rises early, prepares weak coffee, folds laundry still damp from the cold. And beneath the larger questions of politics and guilt, of justice and retribution, there existed the deeply personal question of how to return to a private self after years of public obedience. Lesbian women were often labeled asocial, denied work, denied space. But life, as it always does, continued in kitchens, on park benches, in the flickering warmth of half-repaired homes. For those who had survived under the weight of the regime's gaze, the end brought not only relief, but a deep, confusing ache. Who were they now, without the constant presence of orders, rules, and watchful eyes? Who were they in their own lives again? Their hands almost touch, but do not. Their connection is deep, but invisible. And in the still hush that followed the collapse of Hitler's Germany, those echoes began to settle across the broken landscape of everyday lives. There were no trumpets for most families, no moment of loud victory, only the soft shudder of change as old fears lost their shape, and the world that had once pressed so tightly around the private soul began, ever so slowly, to loosen its grip. They do not call it love, for that word is dangerous. But it is, and it sustains them. In shared flats, young women whispered prayers their fathers had once spoken. In boarding houses, old widows kept framed photographs of sons they could not speak of anymore. The past lingered, pressed into the corners of daily life like dust. The regime's ideal couple was rigidly heterosexual, obedient, fertile, and silent. Any deviation from this norm was viewed not as a private choice, but as a threat to national strength. At night, after the children are asleep, she sits alone in a small wooden chair and writes letters one each week to a man she barely recognizes anymore. His last letter was curt, almost formal. The war has changed him. It has changed her too, though in quieter ways. They nursed soldiers in hospitals, ran rural farms alone while their husbands were at war. They volunteered, sewed, taught, rationed, consoled. Some embraced the regime's ideals with pride. Others complied quietly. Or perhaps they do, but choose not to speak of it. Much of its cruelty unfolded slowly, through policies that reshaped daily rituals, through expectations that hollowed out personal identity. through an atmosphere that made even small acts of individuality feel dangerous. Mothers taught their children to speak carefully, to avoid political jokes, to never talk about what father said at dinner. Daughters learned not to ask too many questions. Sons, especially those nearing Hitler Youth age, were watched carefully, even by their own families. Her husband came home and found the door open, the kitchen light still on. She was simply gone. Marguerite passed the apartment this morning. The hallway smelled of dust and old cabbage. A pair of children's shoes sat quietly at the threshold, and many more existed in a space between loyalty and resignation, performing the expected roles while nursing quiet doubts they dared not speak. She places one before her daughter, who watches her with tired eyes, and another before her husband, who is already halfway out the door. His factory shift starts early. He kisses her cheek, but says nothing. The door closes. Silence again. Only the quiet scraping of a butter knife, the settling groan of an old chair, the distant cough of a neighbor through thin walls. These were the hours in which so much of life unfolded in Hitler's Germany, not in rallies, not on battlefields, but in the intimate, overlooked corners of kitchens, bedrooms, stairwells, and balconies. The private lives of ordinary people were like threads in a vast, tightly woven fabric, stained here, torn there, but never fully separate from the whole. While the regime's outward face was one of power, spectacle, and control, the inner life of the average citizen, especially for women, was marked by a quieter struggle. Not a war of bombs or tanks, but one of identity, expectation, and fear. It was a vision of femininity that placed women firmly in the domestic sphere, elevating motherhood to a national duty, while simultaneously stripping it of its autonomy. A woman was not merely a mother, she was a mother of the Reich. Her womb, her labor, her silence, all were seen as part of a larger mission. Womanhood in the Third Reich was not simply a social role, it was a carefully crafted instrument of state ideology, a tool shaped to serve the regime's imagined future. At the heart of this ideology was the triad of values endlessly repeated in propaganda, speeches, and school books: kinder, Kuch, future children, kitchen, church. And yet, in practice, this vision was far more complicated. Imagine now one such woman. Her name might be Marguerite. Marguerite has learned to lie, not maliciously, just in the small ways required to survive. There is a woman on the second floor who was arrested last week. No one knows why. Life under the Nazi regime was not defined solely by public violence or visible oppression. The regime celebrated motherhood in posters and parades, but punished it with pressure. For those who could not bear children, or who chose not to, life grew lonelier. And what of intimacy? Of love, sexuality, desire? These too were reshaped by ideology. Marriage was regulated. Certain relationships were banned outright. Homosexuality was criminalized. Gay men faced arrest, internment, worse. Imagine now two young women, perhaps neighbors, who meet quietly in the park. They speak softly. One reads poetry aloud. The other listens. This, too, was part of private life under the Third Reich. Hidden relationships, secret glances, letters burned after reading. In bedrooms, wives mourned husbands who had become strangers. There were those who remembered the Weimar years, the brief, uncertain republic that came before the Nazis. In the schools, children learned new songs. They memorized new maps. The textbooks had changed, and in this too lay a form of resistance. These are the moments that do not make history books, but they are history. Quiet remains. How private life endured, fractured, and slowly healed. Even the quietest stories leave echoes. The war was over. The uniforms, the flags, the parades all gone. The silence left behind was vast, almost hollow. Imagine, if you will, a small village in Bavaria. The spring of 1946 arrives, hesitant and damp. Anna is 53. Her husband died in 1943 conscription, pneumonia, exhaustion. The Germany of 1946 was not a place of clarity. It was a place of rubble, literal and emotional. Cities lay in ruins. Records lost. Families scattered. For many, the answer came slowly. In whispering prayers they had not dared speak aloud for years. In homes where Jewish families had once lived, silence took on a different texture: guilt, confusion, sorrow. And in households where young women had once whispered prayers behind closed doors, where forbidden relationships had bloomed quietly in corners, the end of the regime meant, for the first time, a chance to breathe, truly breathe, without fear. Still, the process began. How does one learn to think freely after being taught only to obey? How does one speak love after years of whispering it? These were not the questions of war criminals or political leaders. For women, the transition was especially complex. The regime had defined them so strictly as bearers of children, caretakers of home, symbols of racial purity. And yet, not all wounds healed. Not all stories ended in clarity. Many families carried their silences forward. Many survivors never spoke. But even in these absences, there is something deeply human. Today, if you walk the neighborhoods of modern Germany, you will find small brass plaques embedded in the pavement, stolperstein, or stumbling stones. And that perhaps, somewhere, someone still remembers. In that act of remembering, the quiet resistance of private life lives on. Because even under the most oppressive systems, human beings continue to live, to hope, to love, to fear. So now, as the segment draws to a close, let your mind drift back through these private rooms we visited. There was always something left behind. And that, in the end, is why you likely wouldn't survive a day in such a place. Not because of weakness, but because of your ability to feel. And in remembering that, perhaps you carry forward a quiet promise to protect what is private, to defend what is tender, to never let fear decide what you say to those you love. Sleep now, if you can, knowing that even in the darkest hours of history, there were always hearts still beating. Unseen resistance and quiet disobedience, the smallest defiance, coffee, poems, and unsent letters. There is something profoundly fragile about resistance when it must be whispered. When the boldest act a person can make is not to shout in the square or wave a banner. It broods slowly, quietly, in the still corners of private homes and the long silences between sentences. It did not seek recognition. For the greatest threat to total control is not loud rebellion, but the refusal of the human spirit to conform, even when no one is watching. Often, it hoped only to survive unnoticed. Her husband was once a literature professor, removed from his post in 1936 for refusing to revise his curriculum. As it simmers, she unfolds a linen napkin, places it on the small kitchen table, and opens a warm notebook. It is the refusal to become hollow, the insistence on an inner life, no matter how dangerous. Inside are poems, not copied from books, written by hand. Some her own, others from memory lines once learned by heart in the freedom of earlier years. Now he works as a postal clerk, quietly cataloging letters he no longer reads. Their home is quiet. Nothing political, just jokes, sketches, questions about books they both used to read. He no longer preaches sermons that challenge the regime, but his voice still carries the tone of the old gospel of humility, of justice, of compassion for the outsider. His church is quieter now, but each Sunday the same few faces gather, kneel, and pray. He pretends not to notice the teacher's frown when he does not laugh at propaganda films. He smiles only when it is safe. The shelves once lined with Goethe and Rilke are mostly empty. A grandfather teaches his grandson a poem that has been removed from school books. These letters were never meant to be delivered. They were placed in drawers, burned in fireplaces, folded into the backs of picture frames. But they were written. And in the act of writing, the writer reclaimed truth denied to them in public. A woman hums a lullaby her mother once sang in Yiddish, knowing it must never be heard outside these walls. I don't even know if you're alive, but I wanted you to know the tree in the courtyard has blossomed again this spring. The same white petals you used to brush from your coat. I still watch them fall. By refusing to forget the friends who had vanished, the songs that had been banned, the words that could no longer be spoken aloud. What happened in 1933? Who was Rosa Luxemburg? She never signs her name, but she gives her students the one thing the regime fears most: curiosity. Some books were burned, others hidden. Perhaps you would look at the wrong face too long on the street, or ask why your neighbor's window was dark when yesterday the radio played there. Perhaps you would leave a flower on a doorstep, or fail to cheer at a parade. Not loudly, just ... quietly, subtly. A hesitation, a pause, a memory. She says nothing. She leaves the bread beneath the woodpile, then walks on. No one knows her name. She has no pamphlets, no ideology. Only a quiet sense of right and wrong, passed down from a mother long gone. But simply to hide a book, to burn a letter rather than send it, or to keep speaking the truth in one's own mind, even when the outside world demands silence. To remember was to resist. To grieve, even silently, was to defy the illusion that all had been accepted, all forgotten. He bakes his bread, he opens his shop, he closes each night. The kind that terrifies tyrants, not because of its volume, but because of its unbreakable silence. But every Thursday, he leaves an extra loaf on the doorstep of a home whose occupants have not been seen in months. People who kept a part of themselves alive, even when everything around them demanded they let it die. He never knocks. He never waits. He simply leaves it there and walks on. It is fragile, easily snuffed out, but if guarded carefully, it can still warm the soul. In Hitler's Germany, this ember was kept alive by millions in different ways, through glances, through gestures, through tiny words slipped into conversation when no one else was listening. And it was through these subtleties, these unspoken languages, that the quiet resistance survived. This kind of resistance did not wear uniforms or march in lines, but the symbol lived on. In everyday conversation, certain code words and phrases were used to express disapproval, to question, to mock the absurdities of Nazi ideology without attracting too much attention. A raised eyebrow when referencing the radio, a casual remark about food shortages that carried hidden criticism, sarcasm that pretended to be loyalty. Long after the regime fell, the simple image of a white rose became a memory of what it meant to stand in quiet opposition, not with violence, but with words. When asked what he thinks of the latest speech by the Führer, he nods slowly and says, well, he certainly does speak often. Nothing more, nothing less. But in his tone, in the glint of his eye, another message passes between him and the man in the chair. A message of fatigue, of skepticism, of survival through understatement. Today, if you walk the halls of the University of Munich, you can see their final pamphlets carved into the stone beneath your feet. The BBC, broadcasting from London in German, was strictly forbidden. But many households, late at night, would turn the dial slowly, tuning past the static until the familiar, clear voice came through. Higher spricht London. That is why the state sought to erase the privacy to regulate thought, to standardize education, to transform even childhood games into ideological training. In cities like Cologne and Hamburg, small slogans would appear overnight on alley walls or under train overpasses. Down with Hitler, or Wake Up, with scraps of pencil, on stolen paper, on walls. They recorded names, dates, prayers, names of the dead, words of the living. A record of existence in places built to erase. Each night, the father would carefully transcribe what he heard from foreign broadcasts. He never showed the notes to anyone. He folded them into a book on a shelf, but they were there. A record, a memory, a belief that truth, though buried, still had a place. It replaced moral frameworks with ideology, encouraged people to see the state as the highest good. But many held to older values, Christian, Jewish, humanist, traditional, that gave them a foundation to resist internally, even if they could not act outwardly. Most were quickly painted over, but for those who saw them before they vanished, they were reminders that dissent still breathed, who protected those they could by manipulating systems they understood better than the ideologues, not against laws, but against the erasure of conscience. There were police officers who looked the other way, judges who delivered light sentences under the guise of technicalities. But many still listened in private. They hummed melodies long out of favor. They read from smuggled pages. They copied passages by hand, passing them in classrooms, in cafes, in train compartments. In the official spaces of the Reich, symbols were omnipresent: the swastika, the eagle, the red banners hanging from every public building. Perhaps you would walk too slowly past a poster, or read too long from a banned page. Perhaps you would ask what happened to your neighbor, or why someone's name no longer appeared in the registry. Innocuous in appearance, it became the emblem of a student resistance group in Munich that dared to write and distribute leaflets calling for moral awakening. They favored foreign music, especially jazz, which the Nazis had labeled degenerate. These were the swing youth, not a coordinated political movement, but a subculture of resistance built on rhythm, dance, and non-compliance. For opposition to the war, and for remembrance of humanity, the group was small. It included siblings Hans and Sophie Shaw, along with a handful of university friends. They printed pamphlets in secret. They left them in hallways, stuffed them in mailboxes, dropped them in stairwells. But just beneath this surface, ordinary citizens developed their own counter-symbols, quiet, easily overlooked, but deeply meaningful to those who understood. And yet, these small acts, quiet, humble, unremarkable to the eye, terrified the Nazi regime more than armies did. Among the quiet bravery of those who did not stand tall, but who did not bow either, who lived between the lines, and by doing so, helped keep the truth alive. Imagine a woman named Elise. She lives in a modest third-floor apartment on the edge of Leipzig. Elise wakes each morning before dawn. She brews a weak imitation of coffee made from chicory, ground acorns, or barley, since real coffee is scarce now. Each day, she adds one more. A new poem, a small reflection, sometimes just a single sentence. She does not show these to anyone. She keeps them beneath the floorboards. She writes not to incite revolution, but to remember who she is, who she was, before the silence. In this simple act, rising early, brewing her faux coffee, writing a poem, there exists a form of quiet resistance more enduring than banners. Others resist in smaller ways still. A boy in Berlin, perhaps 16, who passes notes to his Jewish friend in the back row of class. A priest in a rural village who continues to use the old liturgy despite warnings. A housemaid in Munich who uses her afternoon walk to deliver scraps of bread to a family in hiding. These are not the stories that fill textbooks. They are not the names carved into marble memorials, but they are real, and they mattered. The Nazi regime, in its quest for total control, understood something chilling, that real resistance begins not with loud protest, but with the refusal to surrender one's private self. But even then, cracks remained. A mother tucks a banned book beneath her child's pillow. Unsent letters played their part as well. There were many who wrote to loved ones who had disappeared into camps, into exile, into silence. "Dear David," a woman might begin, hands trembling, "I don't know where you are." What courage it took to write such a line. Even in the cities most loyal to the regime, there were those who resisted by remembering. And then there were those who resisted with silence itself. Imagine a baker in Nuremberg. He says nothing to anyone. Or a teacher who reads only from the approved curriculum, but slips into her pupils' hands slips of paper containing dates, names, questions. In Hitler's Germany, to be curious was to be dangerous. So why wouldn't you survive a day? Because perhaps you would ask too many questions. And that would be enough. Because in a regime that demanded total control, even the gentlest forms of human freedom became acts of rebellion. So now, let your mind drift across these small stories. A woman and her poems, a boy and his friend, a priest with an old prayer, a loaf of bread, an unsent letter. These are the threads of quiet resistance, the kind that does not shout, the kind that endures. Sleep, if you wish, imagining these lives. Not heroes in the traditional sense, but perhaps something stronger. That, in the end, may be the greatest defiance of all. Secret symbols, code words, and lives lived between the lines. It is often said that under tyrannies, the truth becomes something you carry inside you, like a small ember hidden beneath layers of ash. Symbols, too, carried weight beyond their appearance. One such symbol was the white rose. They did not call for revolution. They called for conscience. Most of the White Rose members were arrested and executed. Other forms of subtle resistance took shape in language. Imagine an old man in a Berlin barbershop. He sweeps the floor, listens to the radio. In Nazi Germany, saying too much could cost you everything. So people learned to say just enough. Graffiti, too, was used sparingly, but when it appeared, it startled. Even clothing became a language. In some cities, young people who rejected Nazi conformity wore their hair longer, in styles not approved by the regime. Their meetings were secret, their parties brief, but their mere existence was a quiet defiance of everything the regime demanded: uniformity, seriousness, control. Others resisted by listening secretly, carefully to the voices the Reich tried to silence. To listen to that voice was an act of courage. Punishable, dangerous, but also deeply human. One family in Stuttgart kept a notepad beside the radio. The Reich tried to destroy such spaces of interiority. Books were censored, libraries cleared. Music composed by Jews or foreign artists was banned. And in the darkest corners of the regime, its prisons, its camps, there were still those who dared to write. Even within the system itself, resistance took shape. In offices and ministries, there were bureaucrats who stalled papers, who lost documents. None of these people wore the name of a hero, but they saved lives, often quietly, often anonymously. And what of the resistance of belief? The regime demanded loyalty, not only in action, but in soul. A priest who continued to teach love of neighbor, even when neighbors disappeared. A teacher who reminded students that truth mattered, even when textbooks lied. A grandmother who lit Sabbath candles in secret, decades after her synagogue was destroyed. All of these were quiet acts of defiance. So why would you not survive a day? Because perhaps you believe too deeply in questions, in nuance, in affection not approved by the state. Perhaps your resistance would not be loud, but it would be persistent. A word, a silence, a refusal, and in Hitler's Germany, even that was enough to disappear. So now, as you rest, picture the world between the lines. Not the world of speeches and flags, but the quiet world beneath it. The teacup passed with a message. The name scribbled behind wallpaper. The footstep paused before a forbidden door. The truth whispered, not shouted. The poem never published. The kindness no one witnessed. The refusal that went unspoken, but felt. In these small acts lies the truth of resistance. It is not always grand. It is not always remembered, but it is always real. Always human. Let your mind rest there, if you wish. The price of a whisper. When silence was louder than shouting, in a world where every word was weighed and every glance measured, silence could be louder than any scream. And in Hitler's Germany, silence was often the final form of defiance left to those who had nothing else. Explosive, full of bold statements and daring escapes. But for millions of ordinary Germans, and those under German occupation, resistance was often quiet. So quiet, in fact, that no one but the resistor themselves ever heard it. It's easy, from the comfort of hindsight, to imagine resistance as something loud. And yet, even that quiet could be dangerous. To sit in a room where others praise the Führer and say nothing. To decline to hang the flag from your window on a national holiday. But they were noticed. And in a society engineered to observe, report, and punish even the smallest hint of doubt, they came with a cost. To avoid eye contact with the marching boys of the Hitler Youth. To weep, not cheer, at the sound of martial drums. Works of history that do not flatter the regime. These were not grand acts. They left no traces in the official record. They learned to read between the lines, to interpret silences as meaning more than words. A neighbor who no longer greets you on the stairs. A friend who changes the subject when you mention a name. A coworker who asks too many questions with too little warmth. He keeps his store open, even as the list of band titles grows longer. They did not expect recognition. Most of the time, they expected to be forgotten. He complies on the surface. The offensive titles are removed from the front shelves. The posters are displayed in the window as required. A whisper of a world that still valued honesty, empathy, and love. Imagine a man named Otto. He owns a bookshop in a quiet town in the Thuringian Hills. Not a political man, not a revolutionary, just someone who loves books. But behind the counter, beneath a loose floorboard, he hides a few volumes. Old poetry, essays by Thomas Mann, Jewish authors. It only needed to punish a few, loudly enough to make everyone else obey themselves. When trusted customers visit, he waits until the shop is empty. He asks questions, seems friendly, returns the next day. Otto, feeling uneasy, says nothing. There were secret schools, teaching banned history and forbidden languages. There were underground prayer groups. Music played from makeshift instruments, echoing through half-destroyed synagogues. Because your heart responds to suffering without needing permission. Because you might pause too long when asked a question meant to trap you. Because you would find it impossible to cheer for things that feel wrong. Even a game played by a child, pretending they were somewhere else, was a kind of defiance, a refusal to let cruelty define imagination. A week later, Otto is gone. The shop is shuttered. No explanation is given. But at night, alone, she writes in her diary. But in writing it, she preserves something real, something not yet corrupted, not about politics, not about leaders, just about the sunset, the way the light falls on the windowsill. A memory of a song her mother used to sing. His wife says he has been transferred for questioning. No one says the word Gestapo. They don't have to. Then, in a hushed tone, he might say, "I've something you might like, if you're willing to be careful." She is trying to remember what it means to feel, to observe the world without a filter, to bear witness, even if only to herself. He says no more. He doesn't need to. One day, a man comes in, new to town, interested in history. That's the thing about life under total surveillance. People learn to speak around the truth. These are the codes of fear. A journal, a photograph tucked into a wall. And through these, we glimpse the other side of life under the regime, the side not captured in official records. But even in fear, people held on to something small, something stubborn. The cost of that whisper, however, could be extraordinary. Children turned in their parents. Students reported teachers. Postmen noted who received foreign parcels. Fear was not just institutional, it was interpersonal. The system did not need to punish everyone, and so the resistors did not expect rescue. But still, they acted. There were midwives who falsified birth records to protect the identities of hidden infants. There were lawyers who destroyed paperwork, knowing it might save a life. Imagine yourself walking a quiet street where the flags no longer wave. A word becoming a story becoming a truth shared not in defiance, but in healing. Where the radios have gone silent, where the people once afraid to speak begin, little by little, to find their voices again. There were women who sheltered fugitives in root cellars, feeding them crusts, whispering lullabies through trapdoors. Some were caught, some vanished, some survived. Many never spoke of it again. And yet, their quiet bravery created invisible lifelines that carried others through. In the ghettos, too, resistance took many forms. To resist in these ways did not make one safe, but it made one human. And the human spirit, as history shows us again and again, is remarkably resilient. You likely wouldn't survive a day, not because you are weak, but because you are open. Because your mind is accustomed to asking why. Because you would carry your private truth like a small flame, and you would not let it go out. Many did not whisper, or question, or even notice. But it reveals something essential about how a society can slide into darkness, not through fire and noise, but through routine, through habit, through small compromises repeated over time. You don't even notice at first that some of your colleagues are no longer invited to meetings. Or if you do, you assume they must have done something wrong. Your son joins the Hitler Youth, and you attend the meetings. You don't speak of politics. Why would you? You're just a teacher, just a mother, just a citizen. Not the fear of bombs or soldiers, but the quiet, creeping fear of what might happen if you step out of line. He wears the uniform proudly. You think he looks smart in it. He seems happier now, with so much structure. You remember how restless he used to be. You've done nothing wrong. You've been loyal. They followed the rules, waved the flags, said the right words at the right time. They paid their dues, showed up to parades, recited the slogans, in tradition, in discipline. The economy is finally improving. The streets are cleaner than they were. The trains run on time. There are jobs again. And for the first time in years, people seem to believe in something bigger than themselves. Like a sheet of ice stretching over a frozen river, strong enough to walk on, but only just, she is reported. You don't know by whom. You don't ask. The military contracts have been kind. He joins the party, not because he believes in it deeply, but because it helps. He does not ask why his Jewish neighbor's store is suddenly closed, or where the family went. He buys the property at auction. It's good for business. He tells himself that if he hadn't, someone else would have. Makes things smoother. Fewer questions. More opportunities. Her apartment is searched. She is questioned. She is never quite the same after that. But that is not the tone we take here. Ours is not a story of blame, but of understanding. She asks, "Do you know?" The letter is intercepted. He is questioned. An unspoken knowledge that their safety could vanish the moment they stepped 1 inch out of line. To silence. He is reminded that even loyal citizens must remain vigilant. You would ask about it, speak of it, follow it, of reflection. They were not cruel, necessarily. Not even hateful, most of them. Just ordinary. Trying to live, to survive, to find normality in the midst of madness. But in that very fragility lies the strength of what the regime feared most. A free soul. Even among those who said nothing, there was resistance. To be silent, to be still, to follow, and to never, ever ask too many questions. Imagine a woman working in a government office, typing reports all day. She follows the rules. She wears the badge. She never questions orders. The people who told themselves that if they just obeyed, just stayed quiet, just didn't make waves, then they would be spared. She doesn't show it to anyone. She may never show it at all. She is not trying to bring down a government. And isn't that also resistance? In the long years after the war, many such stories were lost, records destroyed, witnesses scattered. But here and there, a letter is found, a world of half-spoken prayers, of sideways glances, of skipped songs at parties, of children taught to dream differently, and yes, of fear, but also of astonishing resilience, the kind of resilience you likely carry within you, the kind that values love over obedience, thought over repetition, compassion over ideology. And that is why a day would be too much, not because you would do something loud, but because, eventually, you would do something small, something tender, something human. You might lend a book. You might weep at a poster. You might remember a friend who vanished. You might tell a child the truth. And in doing so, you would risk everything. But you would also keep something alive. So now, let your breathing slow. In that silence, heavy, uncertain, but full of possibility, imagine a whisper becoming a word. And sleep, if you can, knowing that even in the darkest of nights, some lights are never fully extinguished. Even the smallest acts of resistance acts you might not even notice can echo through time, reshaping the world in ways no banner ever could. And perhaps in this quiet reflection, we can find a gentle reminder to listen closely, to speak softly, and to carry the ember forward, carefully, into the light. Segment 8. Life for the Loyal. Comfort, complicity, and the illusion of safety. The ordinary obedience. How it felt to be safe. Not everyone in Hitler's Germany resisted. And for a while, they were allowed to believe that they were safe. This part of the story is quieter than others. It does not thrill. It does not shock. Imagine yourself in 1937, in a tidy apartment on the outskirts of Nuremberg. You are a school teacher. You believe in order. You don't ask where the Jews went. You don't ask why certain books disappeared from the school library. And so life goes on. There's bread in the shop again, coal in the stove. You hang a flag from the window on the Führer's birthday. You stand in the crowd during the parades. You clap when the radio plays the anthem. But beneath the surface of your comfort is a different kind of fear. Because one day, your neighbor does. She says something careless in the market, something about shortages, about the party. You remind your children not to repeat anything they hear at home. You speak less freely. You are still safe. But your safety feels thinner now. This is what it meant to be loyal in Nazi Germany. It is easy in hindsight to judge such people, to call them complicit, cowardly, because this too is part of the history. And for a while, they were. But that safety was always conditional, always fragile. Imagine a shopkeeper. He sells boots. Business is good. He attends the meetings. He repeats the slogans. He smiles when he is expected to. But one day, a cousin writes from Switzerland. She mentions the war, the camps. He burns the rest of her letters. He tells himself it's just the way things are, that he is still safe. He is not, because in Hitler's Germany, there were no truly safe places, only temporary privileges, only borrowed time. Even the most obedient citizens lived in a kind of suspended tension, and so they clung to routine, to propriety. But deep within them, whether they acknowledged it or not, lived a constant low murmur of unease. You would not survive a day because you would hear that murmur too clearly. You would walk through these tidy neighborhoods, see the flags in the windows, and wonder who put them there out of belief and who out of fear. You would feel the weight of every silence, and you would break it, not with a shout perhaps, but with a glance too long, a question too sharp, a hesitation too obvious. And that would be enough. Because in a world where loyalty is measured by silence, even the smallest noise can make you a target. As you drift now, let yourself rest in the spaces between these ordinary stories. The women sewing uniforms they will never wear. The children learning songs they don't understand. The men sitting quietly at dinner, careful with every word. The shopkeeper sweeping his steps, pretending not to see. The teacher grading essays that say nothing. All of them hoping, quietly, that by obeying, they will be spared. All of them telling themselves that their silence is survival. But deep down, they know it is not. Sleep now, if you like, with this gentle thought, that the world built on silence never truly keeps anyone safe, and that even the loyal, in the end, were never free. The comfortable illusion and the weight of knowing too much. It is often said that the most dangerous lie is the one we tell ourselves. In Hitler's Germany, millions told themselves a very particular kind of lie, not out of wickedness or even ignorance, but out of exhaustion. It was easier, after all, to believe that everything was under control. There were summer holidays in the Bavarian mountains, festivals with brass bands and garlands. There were photographs taken in blooming gardens, wedding portraits hung in frames with the insignia of the Reich subtly engraved in the corners. That the system, though strict, was fair. That if one did not break the rules, one would not be broken. If the sky over the city turned red, not with sunset, but with fire, then one simply closed the blinds, stirred the soup, told oneself that it wasn't happening here, not in this home, not to these people. And so, many ordinary citizens lived out their days inside this illusion, a world that seemed safe, orderly, and stable, as long as you did not look too closely. When asked to attend party women's meetings, she goes. She does not think herself political, just proper, just a good citizen. She asks at the counter, and the new owner shrugs. Not our concern, he says. She lets it go. There were dinners to cook, children to raise, wages to earn. The illusion was carefully constructed, and it was not without effort. They crack, they flake. They demand more and more effort to sustain. It is vague, cautious. It mentions someone being taken in the night. It warns Clara not to write back. Clara folds the letter carefully, places it in a drawer she locks. The state did its part polishing the windows of normalcy, while the house behind them began to crumble. But the people played their role too. She cannot. Her children need food. Her husband needs his job. The house needs to be warm in winter. So instead, she adjusts. She begins to see the small signs. A child's drawing removed from the wall at school. A street name changed. A colleague who never returns from sick leave. She avoids the places where bad things might be seen. They learned, over time, to stop asking certain questions, to tune their ears to specific frequencies, to notice only what was safe to notice. A neighbor missing? Must have moved. A shop closed? Perhaps poor business. A whisper of violence? Surely exaggerated. Surely a rumor. And if on some nights the illusion wore thin, if the radio played too loudly to cover the sound of boots in the hallway, but illusions, by their nature, require constant maintenance. The train stations filled with soldiers going only one way. The women standing in bread lines, eyes darting, voices hushed. Imagine for a moment a woman named Clara. She lives in Dresden. Her husband is a civil engineer. Her children attend the local school. She has no deep political beliefs. She keeps her house clean. A sermon too honest, and a priest who disappeared. A story told by a cousin from the countryside. A mark in the ledger that didn't add up. A notice posted on the wall that made the hair rise on your arms, even if you didn't know why. She plants roses in spring. She wears gloves to the market. But they began to carry a burden of quiet, knowing that the world they lived in was not what it pretended to be. When the regime calls on her to donate for the Winter Relief Fund, she does so. But over time, things shift. The teacher her children loved is gone transferred, they say. The baker she's known since childhood disappears overnight. The pause before repeating the official line. The decision not to report a neighbor. the choice to let a truth live, even if only in silence. Then one day, a letter arrives from her sister in Austria. You would see the fault lines in the illusion, and you would be unable to pretend. She does not speak of it, but it begins to live in her like a quiet echo. She watches the newsreels differently now. She listens more closely to the silences in conversations, and the illusion begins to tremble. It would be easy to think that she acts, that she rises, that she protests, but she does not. She stops asking questions aloud. She writes less. She smiles more. She becomes loyal, not out of belief, but out of weariness. And yet, somewhere within her, the illusion is broken. This is how it happened for many. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare or recognition. They did not all become heroes. They did not all resist to conscience. And that knowing was heavy. Heavier, perhaps, than any uniform or ideology. Because once you know too much, you can never unknow it. You can only carry it. And carrying it, while pretending not to, is its own kind of torment. The propaganda told people that the war was righteous, that the enemies were barbaric, that the Reich was eternal, that everything was under control. But the streets told a different story. The letters that never arrived, the ration cards that grew smaller. For many so-called loyal citizens, the truth came not all at once, but in fragments. A cough behind a curtain, a child who asked the wrong question. And for those who saw these things, there were choices. The faces of once loyal citizens began to change, not from rebellion, not from resistance, but from something far more universal, the quiet erosion of belief. To tell themselves it was fine, to find comfort in repetition, to cling harder to the illusion. Air raid sirens became part of the rhythm of life. Blackout curtains were no longer a precaution. They were a necessity. The rumble of distant bombing became the lullaby of children. Or to begin quietly, to pull away. The newspapers still arrived, their headlines as grand as ever. He read from the approved history books, but his voice lacked conviction. But the truth was, she could no longer stand the sound of rehearsed patriotism. It rang hollow. Supply lines had been cut, the factories bombed. The medals, once symbols of glory, now felt like relics of a disappearing world. The children, too, seemed less certain. They asked fewer questions. They smiled less, but beneath the surface, something shifted. The city, once proud and proud of its pride, had begun to shudder. Even then, even in ruins, the regime punished doubt. A blend of fatigue, shame, and quiet disbelief. Not in rebellion, not in confrontation. They had spoken the right words, and yet their homes were being destroyed. Their sons were dying. Their cities were turning to ash. But in the subtle shift of gaze, you would not survive a day, because perhaps your heart is too porous, too open. You would feel it in the way a child recites a party slogan with too much force, as though afraid not to. In the way a shopkeeper avoids eye contact. In the way a train platform is swept spotless, but no one seems to smile. In the way everything appears normal, but no one breathes too deeply. And you would ask yourself, what am I participating in? And then you would ask, why doesn't anyone else say it? Radio broadcasts praised victories that no longer existed. Newspapers denied rumors of defeat. Soldiers, still in uniform, marched past the rubble. And then perhaps you would say it yourself. And that would be the end of safety. Because even loyal citizens, once they knew too much, became liabilities. And those who questioned even gently, even respectfully, were quickly taught that in a world of illusions, truth is the most dangerous act of all. As you let your eyes close, if they haven't already, imagine the quiet interior lives of those who obeyed on the outside, but wrestled on the inside. The housewives who sat in kitchens at night, wondering what their children were being taught at school. But because of what you could no longer endure, the sound of your own voice repeating a lie, the fathers who turned off the radio when the volume became unbearable, the grandmothers who kept photos of friends long gone, hidden in drawers with linen handkerchiefs, the workers who hesitated just a moment too long when asked to cheer, the loyal whose loyalty was not to a flag but to memory, to family. Sleep gently now, with the understanding that not all resistance looks like defiance. It clung to the backs of church pews, where sermons became shorter and prayers longer. Only the slow unraveling of illusion and the soft echo of choices made in comfort. And not all loyalty is sincere. In Hitler's Germany, even those who believed themselves safe carried a weight of silence, of knowledge, of complicity. And that weight, invisible though it was, left deep marks. You too would feel it. You too would carry it. And perhaps that is why you would not last a day. Not because they had been conquered, but because the lie was finally, undeniably broken. Not because you would shout, but because eventually you would feel too much. And in a world built on numbness, to feel is the most dangerous thing of all. When the walls closed in, the collapse of comfort and the echo of regret, by the later years of the war, the illusion had grown thin, like worn cloth pulled too tightly. In 1943, in Berlin, the streetcars still ran, the bakeries still opened. The exhaustion of those who had spent years pretending not to know. The war, which had once seemed distant and heroic, now crept closer. And the loyal citizens, those who had once whispered that obedience meant safety, now found themselves asking a different question. Had we been lied to? Of course, they did not ask it aloud. That would be dangerous. But the question lived in their bones. A school teacher in Hamburg, who once taught his students that the Reich would last 1,000 years, now came to class with tired eyes. In Munich, a woman who once hosted knitting circles for party wives now avoided her friends. She stayed indoors more often. She told herself she was unwell. In Leipzig, a clerk in a uniform office processed requests for medals that were no longer made. And everywhere, people began to realize quietly, individually, that they had been part of something they could no longer explain. It was not guilt, at least not at first. It was something softer, murkier. They had obeyed. They had followed the rules. And worst of all, their silence had not protected them. This realization settled like dust in the corners of their lives. It did not bring clarity. It brought weight. You might imagine that by now, they would rise, that the spell would break, and the loyal would become brave. But by then, the cost was too high, the web too thick, the habit of silence too deeply ingrained. So they did what people do when the world unravels. They tried to hold it together, one thread at a time. They boiled potatoes in bathtubs when gas ran out. They salvaged bricks from bombed buildings to patch their own walls. They washed with cold water and made soap from animal fat. They slept in basements, their dreams filled with silence and smoke. They lied to their children with soft voices. It will be over soon. Just sleep. And as the regime collapsed, it demanded more loyalty than ever. Propaganda grew louder, even as the city grew quieter. But behind closed doors, the loyal stopped believing. And in that absence of belief, they faced something harder than obedience: regret. The woman who had laughed when her Jewish neighbor was evicted now kept her eyes low in the street. The man who reported a colleague for listening to BBC radio now avoided the post office altogether. The parents who encouraged their son to join the SS now cried at the sound of a knock on the door. And the teacher, still reciting party doctrine, began to lose his voice, not from illness, but from the unbearable strain of pretending. You would not survive a day, not because of what you might say. The loyal had once told themselves that they were not part of the machine, that they were simply trying to survive, that they meant no harm. But as the truth became harder to ignore, that comfort dissolved. And in its place came silence. Heavy, unspoken silence. It stretched across dinner tables. It lingered in stairwells. It hovered over the pages of newspapers. There were no parades in the last year. No triumphant rallies. Even as defeat became inevitable, many still clung to their roles, not out of faith, but because they did not know how else to be. And that is perhaps the greatest tragedy. That obedience, once learned, is hard to unlearn. The man who stamped deportation orders could not simply become a baker. The woman who sorted Jewish belongings could not simply return to mending dresses. The boy who marched under swastikas could not forget the songs he was made to sing. And even if no one spoke of it, they all knew. They carried the memory of their compliance like a shadow one that grew darker, even as the war ended. When Allied troops entered the cities, many of the loyal wept. They looked at the soldiers with a mix of fear and relief. They looked at the ruins and saw themselves reflected. They looked at each other and said nothing. You would not survive a day because you would feel all of this, not just see it. You would feel the tension in the air, the burden in the eyes, the thinness of every smile. You would feel the weight of comfort bought at the price of someone else's suffering, and you would speak. And that would make you dangerous, not to the regime, but to the illusion it required. Sleep now, gently, in the shadow of these truths. There were many who believed themselves innocent, simply because they had not acted. But inaction, too, leaves marks. And silence, when loud enough, becomes a kind of voice. Let your breathing slow, and imagine these quiet lives. The housemaid who never asked where the child went. The factory worker who looked away as prisoners passed. The father who taught his son to obey first and think later. They did not plan evil. They did not commit atrocities. They simply lived inside a system and chose, again and again, to survive through silence. And in doing so, they helped the system survive too. Let us remember this, not with blame, but with clarity. Let us hold it close not as a wound, but as a lesson. That comfort can blind us. That loyalty can seduce us. That pretending not to know is easier than knowing, but costs more in the end. You would not survive a day because your silence would shatter. And in the moment it did, the illusion would collapse. And in that collapse, you might find truth. And truth, in a world built on lies, is a quiet kind of revolution. Segment 9. The invisible victims, overlooked lives, caught in the machine, the ones history forgot, marginalization, survival, and silence. History often remembers the powerful, the leaders, the generals, the architects of conflict and policy. Sometimes it also remembers the martyrs, those who defied the system and paid the ultimate price. But in between these two poles lies a vast, quiet world of people history tends to forget. Those who suffered in ways too subtle to record. Those who were crushed, not by execution, but by erasure. Those whose lives were not ended by the Nazi regime, but quietly undone by it. They were not necessarily in the headlines of the day or the footnotes of history books. They were the forgotten citizens, the overlooked communities, the marginal individuals swept to the edges of society. And yet, to walk even a single day in their shoes under Hitler's Germany would have been unbearable for most of us today. Not because they faced loud persecution, but because they lived every moment on the edge of erasure, with no safety, no recognition, and no space in which to breathe freely. Labeled as asocial, criminal, or un-German, they lived on the periphery of German society long before the Nazis came to power. They were tracked, registered, observed. Laws were passed to limit their travel. Permits were revoked. Access to schools, jobs, and basic services was slowly severed. But under Nazi rule, their status worsened dramatically, and with terrifying quiet. No lobbyists. No foreign journalists rushing to document their removal. Their suffering, though real and devastating, happened in the silence between public policies. You do not understand why your mother weeps when soldiers come. You only know that the world has become small, gray, and frightening. Let us begin, slowly and gently, with the story of the Romani people, perhaps 8 years old, the son or daughter of a violinist or a horse trainer. But because of the crushing weight of being unseen, of being treated as a problem, a statistic, a stain, your life was once filled with color, music, and open skies. But now, your family has been confined behind barbed wire in a small field near Berlin. In the Germany of the 1930s and early 1940s, they were often referred to with a cruel and dismissive term Zigeuner. They no longer teach her about the world beyond their door. Her friends begin to vanish, one by one, sent away for procedures from which they do not return. Notes were kept. Names were underlined in red ink. Authorities began asking questions about ancestry 2 generations back, 3. Medical exams were ordered. Photographs were taken. Measurements recorded. For Romani families, especially those who still lived semi-nomadic lives, there were few safe spaces. A Romani child in 1936 might still go to a school with German children, but the teachers had been instructed to report on them. And many deaf individuals, particularly those institutionalized or living in state care, were quietly operated upon, often without consent or even understanding of what was happening to them. Not to help, not to protect, but to isolate. Their classification was fluid, ever-changing, and constantly subject to scrutiny. Their schools, once places of community, were turned into centers of control. Some were even sent to concentration camps. Teachers, sometimes under pressure, were forced to identify deaf students as unfit. By 1939, many Romani families found themselves relocated first to designated settlements, then to camps. Some were sterilized, others simply disappeared. The Nazis believed in purity of race and body. Those who were born with disabilities, whether physical or sensory, were often subject to cruel scrutiny. And yet, for years, the story of their suffering went largely untold. They had no embassies to speak for them. Imagine yourself, if you can, as a child in one of these families. You served in World War I. You have a wife, 2 children, a respectable job. You do not understand the papers your father is forced to carry. No one calls you by your name anymore, only by your file number. You would not survive a day, not because someone would hurt you directly. Now, let us walk further down the quiet roads of forgotten pain. Consider the deaf community. In Hitler's Germany, being born deaf was not merely a difference, it was a threat, at least in the eyes of the regime's ideology. The law allowed for forced sterilizations. Paragraph 175, a part of the German Penal Code, was reinterpreted to allow for wide-scale arrest and imprisonment of gay men. Lesbian women were also targeted, though less systematically. Their sign language was restricted. Imagine then a girl of 15. She signs fluently but cannot hear. Her family loves her, but they are afraid. Often, they were still considered criminals. And then one morning, her name is called. She is told she is going to the doctor, but she knows what that means now. She does not scream. She cannot. She simply goes, shoulders stiff, eyes wide, heart pounding. You would not survive a day, not because your body would fail, but because your soul would not know how to cope with such betrayal by the very society meant to protect you. Let us now pause for a moment and sit with the stories of the Misklinge people of mixed Jewish ancestry. In Nazi racial policy, such individuals occupied a deeply uncertain space. They were neither considered fully Jewish nor fully Aryan. Some were allowed to remain in jobs temporarily. Others were barred. Some were conscripted into military service until policy changed and they were dismissed. Their fate was not uniform. It was arbitrary. Their lives were full of forms, hearings, appeals. Was their grandmother Jewish? Was their marriage legal? Had they attended synagogue? Each detail could become a weapon. But beneath it lies the quieter violence, the erosion of identity, the forced self-erasure, the heavy, suffocating fog of being constantly watched, labeled, and unspoken. Their existence was a constant game of survival through bureaucracy. You might be a man named Carl, born to a Jewish father and a Lutheran mother. But one morning, a letter arrives. You are now considered a Mischling of the first degree. You must report for questioning. You do not know what to wear, what to say, what tone to take. You rehearse your family tree like a prayer. You feel yourself unraveling, not from any blow, but from the erosion of certainty. This is how so many lived, quietly, anxiously, always on the edge. Not marched through streets or executed on sight, but studied, recorded, judged, treated as though their very blood was an inconvenience. You would not survive a day because you would not know where you stood, and the not knowing would slowly break you. It is the sound of quiet suffering, the kind that leaves no marks, the kind that rarely makes headlines, the kind that fills the lives of those the world never meant to remember. Let us walk gently now into another silence, that of those who loved differently. Homosexuality was criminalized in Germany long before the Nazis, but under Hitler's rule, the laws became more brutal, more invasive. Men were arrested for a look, a rumor, a letter found in a drawer. They were sent to prisons or to camps, where they were marked with a pink triangle, an identification both cruel and inescapable. Many never returned. When asked, she reported the names of patrons who borrowed suspicious materials. Those who did carried the marks, not only on their bodies, but in their silence. After the war, their suffering was rarely acknowledged. They received no reparations. Her apartment, her access to medicine. And over time, she told herself that none of it mattered. That books were only paper. That words didn't bleed, pale. Imagine falling in love and knowing that your love, if discovered, could mean death. Not just isolation, not just rejection, but death. You learn to hide your letters, to destroy your photographs, to smile in public, to erase yourself, and it would haunt you. You build your life on secrecy, on performance. You never hold hands. You never speak freely. And you live each day with the weight of pretending. That is why you would not last long. Not because someone would catch you, but because the loneliness of hiding everything you are would grow unbearable. All these people, the Romani, the deaf, the mixed heritage, the gay, the politically deviant, the socially unfit, they lived lives shaped by silence, control, and fear. But they also lived with something else, an acute awareness of being invisible in a society obsessed with control. And that awareness over time was its own kind of torment. They don't arrest him. They don't search the premises. We speak often of the visible violence of history. That is what this segment remembers. Not the grand speeches, not the towering rallies, but the small lives, the forgotten corners, the people history did not think to name. Let us honor them, not with grand emotion, but with quiet presence, but no longer existed in the eyes of his neighbors. Let us walk with them, gently, for even one day. And perhaps, in doing so, we will understand why we, too, might not have survived a single one. Buried truths, quiet suffering, survival, and the shadows left behind. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, not a scream or a cry, but a low murmur, like wind through a forgotten field. These were the lives on the edge of the Reich. Not at the top, not beneath it, but suspended, hovering, unsure, always at risk. And today, in this final stretch of our journey into the invisible victims of Hitler's Germany, we walk through more of those lives, those quietly bruised and eventually erased. Imagine, now, a librarian. She is 43 years old, a widow, educated but unremarkable. She has always loved books, quiet spaces, the hush of the archive. When the regime began banning literature, she didn't object. She simply removed the titles from the shelves and locked them in a cabinet. Not because she believed, but because she needed to keep her position. But one afternoon, a young man barely 20 whispers to her in the reading room. He asks if she still has those books. He is nervous. She hesitates, but only for a moment. She says no. Later that night, she thinks of him, wonders who he was, where he is now. He does not come back. And in her dreams, the pages of the banned books blow in the wind, each one blank. You would not survive a day because you would ask why, because you would feel that pause, that moment of hesitation. Let us move now to a cobbler in a small village. He is old, bent, with knotted fingers and a limp. He's lived in the same workshop for 40 years. Never joined the party. Never owned a radio. At first, no one bothers him. But then, a rumor spreads that he is a defeatist, that he tells customers the war will be lost. He doesn't. Not really. He simply asks, "When do you think it'll end?" But that is enough. One morning, 2 men arrive. They just stand in his shop, looking at the shoes on the wall, and ask quiet questions. After that, no one visits. The door stays shut. The bell does not ring. And slowly, he stops working. He stops sweeping, stops cooking. The boots on the shelf collect dust. And he disappears, not by force, but by isolation. He lived, but not really. He breathed. This too was suffering. This too was control. You would not survive it because you would notice the silence. You would knock on his door. You would ask where he went, and that would make you suspicious too. Let us continue now toward the cities. In 1942, Dresden still stood untouched by the war's most violent waves. In one of its apartment blocks lived a quiet couple. He was a civil servant. She was a former pianist. They had no children, by choice. She had once studied under a Jewish teacher. Before the regime, before the policies. The lesson continues, but the tremor in the voice lingers. She never mentioned this. But one afternoon, as she plays a Chopin nocturne on the old family piano, a neighbor lingers in the hallway, tells her to focus on her schoolwork, on her behavior. Later, that neighbor makes a note in his district report. Mrs. K continues to play suspicious music, unclear influences. The report is buried in a file, but the effect is immediate. Her husband is transferred to a rural office. She is instructed not to play publicly. The piano is moved to a storage unit. Eventually, it disappears altogether, and she begins to hum, only to herself, only when alone, because music was her memory, and they took even that. This is the kind of loss that does not come with funerals. This is the kind of suffering no monument records. You would not survive a day, not because they'd arrest you, but because they'd take the sound out of your life. Now walk with me into a church. It is Sunday. The pews are full. The sermon is quiet, respectful, but something is missing. The priest speaks of discipline, of strength, of community. He does not mention God's mercy, or love, or grace, because the Reich does not approve of weakness, and love, in its true form, is weakness. There were clergy who resisted, who spoke truth to power, who were imprisoned or worse. But many chose a different path. They remained. They served. They adjusted their words. They did not lie, but they did not speak the whole truth. Imagine sitting in that pew. Your faith once burned bright, but now it flickers, not because of doubt, but because of fear. The prayers feel different now. The hymns feel hollow. You look around and wonder, do they feel it too? But no one speaks. And you go home with a heaviness you cannot name. They were also those it crushed by neglect, by suspicion, by the slow, relentless grind of control. You would not survive a day because you would kneel with questions. And questions, here, are dangerous. Let us remember now the children, not the ones in uniforms, not the ones in parades, but the quiet ones, the ones who watched everything and said nothing. A girl, age 9, notices her teacher cry in class. Later that day, she asks her mother why they no longer see Mr. Goldstein next door. Her mother hushes her. That night, the girl lies in bed, staring at the ceiling. She doesn't understand politics, or race, or ideology, but she knows something is wrong. And that knowing becomes part of her. It shapes her silence. It sharpens her instincts. She learns, too early, how to hide her thoughts. And later in life, she will forget some of this, but not all. You would not survive a day because you would want to tell her the truth. But truth, here, is heavy and forbidden. Let us return to the margins now, back to the places few dared to look. There were those who refused quietly, not with words, not with banners, but by simply being kind. A nurse who gave an extra blanket to a dying patient with a pink triangle. A grocer who kept delivering food to a Jewish family, even after others stopped. A tram operator who closed the door quickly to prevent a raid from catching someone inside. None of them stopped the system, but each one, in their small way, created a crack. And cracks, over time, can become breaks. But they paid prices. The nurse was reassigned. The grocer arrested. The tram operator disappeared. And no one spoke of them again. You would not survive a day because you would see the small cruelty, and you would try to interrupt it. And that would be enough to end you. This is why these stories matter, not because they are grand, but because they are real. They remind us that tyranny does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives with paperwork, with rumors, with silence. It lives in fear, in compromise, in exhaustion, and in many people, just trying to make it to the next day. The invisible victims of Hitler's Germany were not only those the regime targeted, and you, walking among them, breathing their air, carrying your conscience, you would feel it. In the glances that don't meet your eyes, in the locked drawers, in the curt greetings, in the way everyone talks around the truth, but never through it. And you would not survive, not because of violence, but because of the unbearable weight of knowing too much and being allowed to say nothing. Let us lie down now and rest in this memory. Let the names you never learned settle softly in your thoughts. Let the stories without endings find a place in your silence. And remember that sometimes the bravest act is to notice, to remember, to not look away, even when it is easier to forget. Echoes across time, the lingering shadows of a fallen regime, what came after? Memory, judgment, and the struggle to understand. It ended not with a bang, but with a collapse. The regime that had shaped lives, rewritten histories, and manufactured silence crumbled into ash and rubble. Berlin, once the polished heart of the Reich, now stood charred and broken. Streets littered with bricks, walls bearing the scars of shells, flags taken down, statues toppled, and across the cities, towns, and countryside, the question began to whisper in doorways and train stations. Now what? Imagine the quiet just after surrender. Not the silence of oppression, but a deeper stillness, the kind that follows destruction. The uniforms were gone, the posters stripped from walls, the loudspeakers silent. It sat with them. It asked hard questions in soft voices. It was not peace, not yet, just the absence of further violence, the breath before the reckoning. A woman in front of you wears the same coat she wore during the war. You remember her from rallies. She smiled once while holding her child and a party pamphlet. And amid that breath stood the people of Germany, looking around, blinking into a world they no longer recognized. But memory did not vanish with the symbols. And in kitchens and basements and city ruins, it lingered, with papers, with tribunals. They brought justice, or their version of it, and they also brought mirrors. But these were distant figures to most ordinary Germans. They had been faces in newspapers, not neighbors. Who were we? Who had we become? What mattered more, what weighed heavier, was the question of personal responsibility. They forced the German people to look at what had happened, to confront what had been built in their name. It was bureaucratic, layered, sometimes flawed. Every German adult had to fill out a form declaring their role during the regime. Many claimed ignorance. Others claimed victimhood. Few admitted guilt. What had we done? Schools needed staff. Offices needed clerks. Trains needed engineers. And slowly, the past was folded into the present. What had we allowed? A few were prosecuted. The Holocaust was acknowledged, but often at arm's length. And why? Grandparents guarded stories. Parents changed topics. Children asked questions and learned, over time, to stop. The Americans, British, French, and Soviets moved in, not just with troops, but with cameras. The Nuremberg trials came first. High-ranking officials brought before judges. Their crimes listed, detailed, translated, read aloud in court. Imagine yourself standing in line for bread in 1946. The bakery still functions, but just barely. The shelves are emptying fast. Many remembered being proud, being hopeful, being normal. Now she says nothing. She does not meet your eyes. They knocked on doors where their families had once lived, only to find strangers. You wonder, does she remember? They were not given monuments. Not then. Not yet. Does she regret? Was she ever truly convinced? And then you wonder the same about yourself. This was the struggle of the post-war years. Not just the rebuilding of homes and bridges, but the reconstruction of identity. And underneath those questions, even more quietly, did we deserve to be forgiven? The Allies attempted a process called denazification. Teachers, doctors, train conductors, shopkeepers, all were reviewed, files opened, lives examined. Some lost their jobs, but most were quietly reabsorbed into society because the country needed to function. But forgetting is not the same as healing. And so, a different silence grew on, shaped not by fear, but by discomfort. Families sat at dinner tables, and there were things they did not say. History was taught, but carefully. Names were listed, but not always discussed. And the lives we spoke of earlier, the invisible ones, remained mostly invisible. The post-war German citizen, if they had been loyal, struggled with two truths: that they had been part of something vast and brutal, and that they themselves had not always felt cruel. About what people do with memory. About how nations rebuild not just buildings, but moral foundations. How to square those memories with the truth. It was easier, often, to forget, or to say, that's just how it was. There are museums, memorials, school programs, commemorations, but not everyone could forget. Some survivors returned. Not many, just a few. They stood at train stations with empty eyes, carrying no luggage. Some were welcomed. Others were told, "We didn't know. We did nothing. It wasn't us." But of course it had been. In part. In silence. In looking away. You would not survive a day, not because someone would come for you, but because you would want to ask questions no one was ready to answer. What did it feel like to send your neighbor away? Why did no one protest when the teachers disappeared? Why did you say nothing when the synagogue burned? And you would hear, again and again, it was different then. You don't understand. You weren't there, and maybe that is true. But understanding is not always about experience. It is about honesty, about listening, about refusing to look away, even when it's easier. This final segment is not just about Germany in the 1940s. It is about what happens after regimes fall. And it is slow, painfully slow. Germany today is different. It is a place that, for all its flaws, has attempted to reckon with its past. But this was not immediate, not silence, but something deeper. A quiet filled not with emptiness, but with weight. It is the hush that settles when the last soldier goes home, when the flags are folded, when the rubble has been swept from the streets, but not from the minds of those who walked them. It took decades, and still there are shadows, whispers, political tides, old beliefs wearing new clothing. That is why we remember, not to assign eternal guilt, but to guard against forgetting, because the road to dictatorship is not paved only with fire. It is paved with compromise, with comfort, with looking the other way. Not entirely. It was made of people, and that is perhaps the most haunting truth of all. And in the end, the people who lived through it, the quiet ones, the loyal ones, the invisible ones, they all carried something afterward. Some buried it deep. Some spoke of it softly, only at the end of their lives. Some never said a word, and some just a few wrote letters, long unmailed letters, to themselves, to God, to no one. Letters that said simply, I saw, I knew, I didn't do enough. You hear a knock at the neighbor's door and flinch. You wake in the night from dreams that make no sense. You see a former official, now working as a tailor, and feel your stomach turn not from fear, but from confusion. You've just hung new curtains. The war feels distant, at least on the surface. I'm sorry. History may not always remember those letters, but they existed, scattered in drawers, hidden in diaries, written not for absolution, but for understanding. And you would be told to move on. You would not survive a day, not because of what was done to you, but because of what you might be asked to carry afterward. And that weight, that quiet grief, that echo across generations, that is the true cost of such a regime, and it lingers still. A soft exit from the past, memory, comfort, and a piece of perspective. There is a quiet that comes after great noise. And this is where we end our journey, not in fire or fear or judgment, but in the soft dim light of memory, in the reflections that come when the world has stopped turning so fast, in the stories we tell long after the headlines have faded. Because for all its brutality, for all its cruelty, the regime we've spoken of was not made of monsters. Ordinary people. People who believed or feared or pretended. People who wanted to survive, to feed their families, to avoid trouble, to stay unnoticed. And in doing so, they allowed the unthinkable to become routine. The machinery of Nazi Germany was vast, but it was oiled by 1,000 tiny acts of obedience, and 1,000 more acts of silence. That silence, though it protected many in the short term, echoed long after the last air raid siren fell quiet. Imagine now, sitting in your apartment in 1951. The city is half rebuilt, but there's an ache that doesn't go away, because nothing was ever resolved, not completely. The regime is gone, but the residue remains, in old habits, in strange silences, in eyes that do not meet yours when you speak too freely. This is the long tale of tyranny. It does not simply fall when the leader dies. It curls around the next generation. It lives in hesitation and in quiet mistrust. You would not survive a day, not because someone would hurt you, but because you would ask why the wounds have not healed. But moving on is not the same as healing, and so many never truly healed. Some buried themselves in work, in church, in drink, in forgetfulness. Others emigrated, hoping a new land could offer peace. A few tried to tell the truth, but were shouted down, or disbelieved, or simply ignored. And still others kept diaries, not for publication, but for preservation. They wrote about dreams that didn't make sense, about feelings they could not explain, about faces they remembered too clearly and names they had almost forgotten. And always, in the background, the same question repeated itself. Could it happen again? That question hung in the air like the smell of smoke after fire. not just in Germany, but everywhere. Because the story of Nazi Germany is not just a German story. It is a human one. It is about what happens when fear becomes law, when difference becomes danger, when cruelty is called order. And those patterns are not confined to one country or one era. They live in us, in every society that asks citizens to look away, to accept, to nod politely when something doesn't feel right. This is why we remember, not to punish, not to dwell, but to stay awake. And ironically, that is what makes this moment so valuable. Because as you drift toward rest, toward stillness, your mind holds on to threads from history, threads woven with complexity, with sorrow, with learning. You don't need to stay alert to remember. You don't need to feel guilt to carry compassion. You don't need to relive the past to refuse its repetition. All you need to do is see it, to hear it, to sit with it for a while. And that is what you have done. Through each chapter, each voice, each slow unfolding of forgotten lives, you have walked gently through a time most would not survive. You have listened not for drama, not for thrill, but for understanding. And that matters. Because remembrance, when done softly, becomes resilience. It becomes a quiet refusal to let the world forget. Now, let us end this long journey in peace. Let the shadows fade into soft dusk. Let the names settle in your memory like smooth stones in a stream. Let the stories rest. There is comfort now, not in what happened, but in the fact that it has been witnessed by you, here, now, in this moment. History cannot change, but how we hold it can. And tonight, you have held it with care. Now, gently, let it go. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift. Let the weight of memory lighten. The world is quiet now. The page has turned. Sleep well. You are safe.